Good morning, and welcome to this virtual board meeting of the National Transportation Safety Board. I'm Robert Sumwalt, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the NTSB. Joining us today are my colleagues on the board, Member Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Jennifer Hamady, Member Michael Graham, and Member Tom Chapman. Today we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the collision of a westbound freight train into the side of an eastbound freight train at a switch near Carey, Ohio on August the 12th, 2019. Both were CSX trains. Each board member has carefully studied the draft report, and each of us have met individually with the investigative staff. Today's board meeting is the first time that we, as a deliberative body, will have gathered to discuss the report. Each train cruise consisted of a locomotive engineer and a conductor. And while the engineers of both trains suffered minor injuries, there were, thankfully, no deaths and no placarded hazardous material rail cars derailed or were breached. Accident damages were estimated right at around $4.9 million. Today, we on the board will explore the westbound locomotive engineers' degraded performance and the role of impairment. We will also talk about the efficacy of CSX's random drug and alcohol testing program. We will ask why the Federal Railroad Administration has not initiated efforts to require inward-facing image recorders on freight trains, although such efforts have already begun for passenger trains. And finally, we will discuss railroad switching operations in territory with positive train control and the use of PTC's restricted mode. In today's board meeting, the staff will lay out the pertinent facts and analysis found in the draft report. They will present findings, a probable cause, and recommendations to the board, and then we on the board will question staff to ensure that the report, as we adopt it, truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. The public docket for the report contains nearly 1,000 pages of additional relevant material, and it's available on our webpage, that's ntsb.gov. The report on the accident will also be available on that same webpage once it's been formatted and finalized in the coming weeks. So at this time, I'd like for each of my colleagues on the board to introduce themselves. Good morning, Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to be here, and good morning to my fellow board members.
Great seeing you. Member Hamady, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to the staff. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, and I do too. Member Graham.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, fellow members and staff. I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Member Graham, good to see you. And Member Chapman, hello.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the team for an excellent job on this investigation.
I'll now ask Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce the investigative and the support staff who will be participating in today's board meeting. Good morning, Mr. Curtis.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Sumwalt. I'd like to thank first everyone who helped make this virtual board meeting happen today. It's been a real team effort involving many staff members and a range of offices. My only administrative announcement this morning is a reminder for the meeting participants to silence all electronic devices at this time. Now I will introduce the staff for today's meeting. On the panel this morning, unless otherwise noted, are the following staff members from the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials. Rob Hall, the Director for the office. Mike Hiller, Acting Deputy Director. Dave Butcher, Chief, Railroad Division. Dana Sanzo, Deputy Chief, Railroad Division. Ruben Payen, Investigator in Charge. Brian Frigo, Operations. Dr. Bob Beaton, Drugs and Alcohol Testing. Dr. Michelle Waters, Medical Officer from the Office of Research and Engineering. Devin Chen, Recorder Specialist from the Office of Research and Engineering. Darlene Hatchett, Director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Casey Blaine, Deputy General Counsel for the NTSB. Jim Ritter, Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. Carol Waldrop, Safety Recommendations from the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Greg Scott and Troy Lloyd, Visuals from the Office of Research Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials. And Gina Evans, Report Writer-Editor from the Office of Railroad, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the investigator in charge, Mr. Ruben Payan. Mr. Payan.
Good morning. On August 12, 2019, about 5:09 a.m. local time, westbound CSX freight train H70211 collided with the side of eastbound CSX freight train W31411 at a switch near Carey, Ohio. Each train's crew consisted of a conductor and a train engineer. The trains were operating on the CSX Columbus subdivision, which extends from Columbus, Ohio to Fostoria, Ohio. This is an aerial view of the collision site. The lead locomotive of the westbound train and 4 rail cars loaded with trash were derailed. The eastbound train derailed 21 rail cars loaded with frac sand, and as a result of the collision, the eastbound and westbound train engineers suffered minor injuries. Collision damage was estimated at $4.9 million. The eastbound train originated in Ottawa, Illinois, and consisted of a lead locomotive, a trailing locomotive, and 110 rail cars. While traveling to Garrett, Indiana, the eastbound train experienced a failure of the onboard locomotive global positioning system, which required the train crew to report the failure and receive permission to disable the PTC system and continue traveling towards Columbus, Ohio. The westbound train consisted of a lead locomotive and a distributive power unit locomotive in the 94th position of the train. The westbound train departed Parsons Yard in Columbus, Ohio, with 109 loads of trash and 67 empty rail cars. Their first job assignment was to travel about 73 route miles and set out 30 empty rail cars in a siding track in Carey, Ohio, and then continue traveling to Fostoria, Ohio. The train departed Columbus, Ohio, with the PTC system in active mode. Once the empty rail cars were placed in the siding track in Carey, Ohio, the remaining rail cars on the westbound train were reassembled. The train conductor remained at the Carey siding, assisting another train with their work, and planned to ride a railroad shuttle van to the Highway 3 grade crossing to board the lead locomotive and rejoin the train engineer in the locomotive cab. The westbound train departed Carey and traveled about 2 miles to Control Point Springs. Forward-facing image recorder data from the westbound train indicated the wayside signal at CP Springs was visible and indicating a red aspect, which required the westbound train to stop before going past the red signal. The westbound train, however, continued past the red signal at CP Springs at a speed of about 9 miles per hour and collided with the 6th rail car of the eastbound train. The eastbound train had a signal at CP Springs routing the train from the single main track onto main track 2. The eastbound train was going about 23 miles per hour at the time of the accident. FRA post-accident toxicology testing of the westbound engineer's blood and urine samples that were collected 6 hours after the accident was positive for blood alcohol at 0.115. Results were also positive for inactive marijuana metabolites in blood and urine. Safety issues explored in the draft report include train handling and performance, CSX Transportation Random Drug and Alcohol Testing Program, inward and outward facing image recorders, and railroad switching operations with PTC. Parties to this investigation included the Federal Railroad Administration, CSX Transportation, the Brotherhood of Railroad Signalmen, the International Association of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers, and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen. For today's board meeting, staff has prepared presentations on railroad switching operations in PTC territory, inward and outward facing image recorders, and random drug and alcohol testing. Our first presentation will cover railroad switching operations in territories with positive train control systems. CSX implemented the interoperable electronic train management system to comply with FRA regulations requiring the installation of a positive train control system on certain railroad tracks. IETMS was installed and functioning on the CSX Columbus subdivision on the day of the accident. IETMS is a safety-critical vital overlay system that interfaces with existing signal systems, wayside devices, and other train dispatching systems. IETMS provides the means to enforce compliance of movement authorities, speed restrictions, work zones, and switch positioning. A PTC system in active mode enforces train movement authorities conveyed by the wayside signal system. As a train approaches a more restrictive signal, the train crew will see a visual display on their monitor that informs the train crew to operate at a speed that will allow the train to stop at the red signal, which is the limit of their movement authority. If at any time the braking curve violates the warning curve, the PTC system will take some control of the train operation away from the train crew by initiating a full-service penalty brake application that will stop the train before the train can go past a red signal. The CSX PTC system was designed in part to prevent trains from operating into occupied track blocks or travel past a red absolute signal. Trains operating on PTC territory are unable to make a reverse or shove move on main track with PTC in active mode. When required to perform pickups, set-offs, shoving moves, or other switching activities, trains with active PTC must first bring the train or locomotive to a stop and then switch PTC from active mode to restricted mode. The westbound train departed Columbus, Ohio with the PTC system activated and functioning. The westbound crew's first job assignment was to set out 30 empty rail cars in Carey, Ohio. The train crew used the PTC restricted mode to allow them to perform their switching movements. In restricted mode, the PTC system allows train movements at restricted speed, but will no longer enforce an absolute stop before a train can violate a red stop signal. After completing the work in Carey, Ohio, the conductor, working on the ground at the rear of the train, planned to ride a railroad shuttle van to a nearby highway railroad grade crossing to board the lead locomotive and continue westbound to their next job assignment in Fostoria, Ohio. The engineer of the westbound train departed towards the grade crossing with the PTC system still in restricted mode and continued westbound for about 2 miles to the accident location. Event recorder data indicated the train speed never exceeded 20 miles per hour, which is the upper speed limit threshold of the CSX restricted speed rule. Following the accident, CSX implemented changes to their PTC switching operations by issuing a revised bulletin. Train crews are now required to conduct a safety briefing when initiating any operating mode other than PTC active mode, such as PTC restricted mode. The revised PTC bulletin, which clarified the previous rules and required the train crew to return the PTC to active mode, is a type of administrative control that mitigates the risks associated with operating in PTC restricted mode on main tracks. Within the hierarchy of control methods to mitigate identified hazards, administrative controls are less effective than other mitigation activities. According to FRA regulations found at Title 49, CFR Part 236, a PTC system is considered to be configured to prevent train-to-train collisions if trains are required to be operated at restricted speed and if the onboard PTC equipment enforces the upper limits of the railroad's restricted speed rule. Train operations with PTC in restricted mode meet the FRA requirements of a PTC system configured to prevent train-to-train collisions. The Interoperable Train Control Application Committee, ITC, which is composed of 4 Class 1 railroads, is developing an engineering control to address risks associated with PTC switching between active mode and restricted mode. Through the ITC, CSX is developing software changes to the PTC restricted mode. The software change will establish a threshold based on time and/or distance before the train engineer will receive a prompt that requires an acknowledgement before continuing movement in restricted mode. The PTC software change being developed is an example of the implementation of an engineering control. Engineering controls are favored over administrative controls since they are designed to eliminate or reduce the hazard before it can cause an accident. The draft report proposes recommendations to address these issues. That concludes this presentation. Mr. Friga will now discuss inward and outward facing image recorders.
Good morning. As you heard in the opening presentation by Mr. Payan, the use of alcohol by the engineer played a significant role in this accident. However, due to the lack of inward-facing cameras, investigators were unable to determine the exact actions of the engineer during the accident sequence. 10 years ago, the NTSB recommended to the FRA to mandate the use of inward and outward-facing image recorders on trains. Although the FRA has initiated efforts to require these recorders on passenger trains, no similar action has been taken to mandate recorders on freight trains. The Westbound train crew's first job assignment was to set out rail cars in Carey, Ohio. This requires the conductor to leave the locomotive cab. Locomotive event recorder data indicated that the train crew worked in Carey for about 37 minutes. During this time, the locomotive engineer was alone in the locomotive cab. After setting out the rail cars and leaving Carey, the locomotive engineer was alone in the locomotive cab for an additional 24 minutes. During this time of approximately 1 hour, the locomotive engineer was solely responsible for the safe operation of the train. During the post-accident interview with investigators, the westbound train engineer was unable to recall several events leading up to the accident. Inward-facing audio and image recorders in the locomotive cab would have provided important information to assist investigators in determining the engineer's actions leading up to the accident. Because the FRA has not required inward-facing cameras for freight locomotives, the NTSB was unable to determine the actions of the westbound train crew members while operating the train from Columbus, Ohio to Carey, Ohio, and the actions of the westbound train engineer while operating alone in the locomotive cab. On July 24th, 2019, FRA issued an NPRM titled Locomotive Image and Audio Recording Devices for Passenger Trains, mandating the installation of inward and outward-facing recorders in passenger trains. This NPRM does not apply to freight railroads. Staff believes that 10 years without action is unacceptable, and therefore, staff is proposing, reiterating, and reclassifying recommendations for the following safety issues: the requirement for inward-facing image and audio recorders in all locomotive cabs and cab car operating compartments, and the use of data from inward-facing image and audio recorders to verify that crew actions are in accordance with rules and procedures that are essential to safety. This concludes my presentation. Dr. Beaton will now present the drug and alcohol testing program safety issues associated with this accident.
Good morning. I will discuss the federally mandated random drug and alcohol testing as it applies to CSX transportation in this accident. The U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT, requires all regulated transportation services to maintain drug and alcohol testing programs. The general principles and practices for these programs are described in Title 49 CFR Part 40. For regulated railroads, the DOT requirements have been implemented in Title 49 CFR Part 219, which outlines the goals and procedures established by the Federal Railroad Administration, or FRA, for workplace drug and alcohol testing programs. Each railroad covered by these federal regulations develops, implements, and operates its own drug and alcohol testing program, subject to the approval and monitoring of the FRA. CSX has implemented a random drug and alcohol testing program for its operations. The regulated employees that are covered by these testing requirements are divided into sampling pools. Train crews are grouped into 9 different sampling pools, and the pools are subject to random tests throughout a year. Selection for random drug and alcohol tests are not done by individuals or by person under the CSX testing program. Instead, a test location and a time window are chosen randomly, and the crews of the first trains to arrive and depart at that location are tested. The FRA performed an audit of CSX testing program in May of 2016 to check its compliance with federal regulations. The FRA found defects in CSX's random selection process. Following that audit, CSX purchased and implemented a new random selection software program. The FRA subsequently performed a follow-up review that revealed general compliance with the regulations. In May 2019, the FRA completed another audit of CSX's program. In that audit, the FRA indicated concern that overall CSX's alcohol and drug program was not functioning at an acceptable level of compliance or efficiency. The FRA auditors observed numerous instances where CSX field managers were unavailable to schedule testing or did not schedule the testing to ensure that random selections were completed. Specifically, the FRA's Office of Technical Oversight said that CSX had not prioritized federal drug and alcohol testing and did not sufficiently perform follow-up testing on employees returning to work after violations. The FRA discovered during the course of its audit that CSX failed to complete required testing for multiple crafts in 2017, including the engine service craft and the train service craft. CSX is required to randomly test 25% of its train service craft for drugs and 10% for alcohol. CSX failed to meet these federal minimums in 2017, where it tested only 19% of its train service employees. In April of 2020, DOT's Office of Inspector General, or OIG, reported oversight weaknesses in FRA's review, approval, and enforcement of railroads' drug and alcohol programs, a report that included CSX transportation. OIG found that FRA did not meet its auditing goals, lacked critical expertise and processes, and may not be able to identify programmatic deficiencies or system-wide safety issues. During the Carey investigation, the NTSB found that the Westbound engineer had not been drug tested for the prior decade, that is from 2019 back to 2010, but had received 2 alcohol tests in that period. For the same 10-year period, based on the records we were provided, the westbound train conductor had received a total of 7 tests, which included 3 drug tests and 4 alcohol tests. At the time of the accident, the westbound train engineer was found to be impaired by his use of alcohol. He also tested positive for marijuana metabolites, but his impairment from THC could not be determined. The NTSB is concerned that 10 years without a drug test appears unusual for a random selection process. NTSB has developed safety recommendations for DOT to understand the circumstances that allowed a regulated employee to operate for an extended period of time without being subjected to random drug testing, as well as to implement enhancements to the testing protocol to fix any identified problems. This concludes my presentation. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Payan. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes staff presentations. The investigative team is prepared to take any questions the board members may have.
Mr. Payan, thank you very much, and to the staff, thank you for those presentations. We'll now turn to questions from the board members, and we will begin with the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The engineer's level of impairment, I guess, could best be described as significant. In the post-crash interviews with the conductor, did he notice any indications, slurred speech, uncoordinated movements, something on the engineer's breath before he left the cab to work on the set out?
Yes, I'll let our operations group chairman, Mr. Frigo, begin that answer, and then maybe Dr. Waters can fill in behind him.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In the interview with the conductor, he did not indicate that anything was abnormal with the engineer. You know, he really said it was just like a normal night. In fact, that they were joking and everything was proceeding as usual. And it should be noted that they have worked together several times before.
Okay, thank you. This is probably for Dr. Waters, but how much alcohol would it take for a habitual alcoholic to consume over what period of time? And is it possible that this engineer could have imbibed while he was on duty?
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Yes, it is possible, or well, it is also possible that he could have imbibed prior to starting work. What we did is calculate backwards. It's fortunately, alcohol is relatively easy to discuss its metabolism, and there's a nice fixed rate that you can backtrack for. So we estimated at the time of the accident, given his weight, that he was probably had an blood alcohol concentration about 0.2. Either way, 6 hours after or at the time of the accident, he was impaired. You can use that same rate to backtrack back to perhaps the time he started work, in which case he probably would have been closer to 0.3 or even 0.4. Sadly, for chronic alcoholics or people who have habitual drinkers, they develop much more of a tolerance to alcohol, and therefore they both compensate physiologically in terms of the processing of the alcohol, as well as the brain adaptations, as well as behaviorally. And so you have some learned behaviors that you can do that outwardly you may not appear as intoxicated. So yes, it's possible. It's possible he drank during the course of the job. It's possible that he drank prior to getting to work. We cannot estimate that based on these calculations and the information we have in terms of his drinking habits. But yes, it could be unnoticed that he had some problems.
Thank you. This may be a how high is up question, either for you or for Dr. Beaton, but do we have any data to show how often random drug and alcohol testing would be required in order to both either deter or catch someone who is a habitual user? Because that's really what we're depending on here in order to keep the system safe.
I'll start that answer. Thank you for the question, Vice Chair. The current DOT programs are based on sampling rates that have been long-standing and apply across several different transportation modes. The percentage sampling rates for the program to deem itself effective, as we've talked about here, are 25% sampling for the drug test, 10% sampling for the alcohol test. Now those numbers can float up and down based on the history that an operator demonstrates with compliance, that is for deterring their workforce from abusing the drugs or alcohol. So in some cases, sampling will be increased, or in others it may be reduced. So it's really, the data that we have is really based on the total number of positive tests that we've received in a prior year. The one caveat that I will put on my answer is that the intention of these programs is to deter people from abusing drugs and alcohol, more so than actually catching people that are intoxicated or impaired while they're working. So it's a subtle difference there.
Very good. Hold that thought, because it'll be coming back in the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good questions, Vice Chairman. Thank you very much. And Member Hamady.
Thank you. And Dr. Beaton, you pretty much left off where I was going to start. You said that the purpose of a random drug testing program is to deter the use of drugs and alcohol on duty. Can you briefly, or somebody else, describe what the process is for the railroads in scheduling for train and engine pools, random drug testing?
Okay, thank you for that question. And my response here is going to be focused primarily on how CSX does it, because railroads that fall under the purview of these programs do develop their own programs, and there are some individual differences. But for CSX, what they do is divide their workforce into about 9 regions to develop pools in each of those regions. And for each of those pools, they use a computer program to determine how many individuals will be sampled across what they set up to be their testing quantities and testing days. When a location is identified for testing, the program administrators will notify the local managers, usually up to 10 days in advance, so that the local managers can ensure that the employees who will be tested are available for testing. That's done with the intention of that is to be done confidentially, not to put the employees on notice ahead of time. So on the day of testing, the employee then is made available to take whatever test is required, the drug or the alcohol test.
Well, and I just there's a 4-hour testing window that they pick for train and engine pools, and that's what I want to talk about. So they schedule this 4-hour testing window, and all the inbound trains that come in to that location, they pick certain locations randomly, and the trains that come in, that crew is tested for drugs and alcohol. And then the outbound trains for that 4-hour window only get tested for alcohol. And so that's very different than how it's done for the rest of CSX's employees and for other railroad employees, where they may be chosen by personal identifier or social security number, randomly selected. And so I'm trying to figure out, for train and engine employees, The regulations require each covered employee must have an equal chance of being selected each time a selection is made. So for train and engine employees that are going into this location for this 4-hour block that the railroads have chosen, do you believe that provides an equal chance of being selected each time a selection is made?
Well, the CSX program requires that when an employee is tested, their name is returned to, or after their test, their name is returned to the pool, so that that is they're performing sampling with replacement. So in principle, that step does ensure an equal likelihood that all employees in that pool could be sampled. Okay,
and the reason why I'm asking is whether that process could have contributed to, in this case, the engineer not being tested for drugs for a decade. And, well, we don't have, for the conductor, the records we have indicate that the conductor may have not been tested for alcohol for 10 years. And so, and that's really just based on, you know, whether we have accurate records or not from CSX, but seems like a problem.
Yes, that's correct. There does seem to be, and I'll base this on the audits that FRA has performed, there does seem to be some local issues, whether it's back in previous audits, 2016 timeframe, what sort of sampling they were using, and more recently in 2019 audits, how well the local managers are actually implementing the test programs. And there's been repeated cases where there were problems at the local level where these tests were either not scheduled or maybe scheduled, but the employee was not made available.
And that's the issue I'm going to come back and talk to you about in the next round.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. And Member Graham, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask some questions about the CSX PTC training. And specifically, when did CSX start the PTC training, and when did the engineer of the westbound train receive PTC training?
Thank you for your question. So the training program was developed as part of CSX's PTC implementation plan, which is submitted to the FRA and includes elements for training within it. Within those elements there's a classroom portion that includes use on a simulator, which would be a 3 to 4 hour session on that simulator using PTC and the functionalities of PTC. The engineer, his most recent certification was in January of 2019, so that would have been his most recent training classroom portion and a simulator ride, both with PTC as part of it. There's another training that occurred in November of 2018 and in June of 2017. And again, this would have been PTC training on the material that included restricted mode, and then also using a simulator. It should be noted, though, that at the time of the accident and currently, that CSX's simulator program does not include training on restricted mode.
Okay, so you just told me it did not include restricted mode, but prior to that, you said the training was supposed to have restricted mode in it. So the engineer never received formal training on restricted mode?
Let me clarify that. So the classroom portion of the training includes restricted mode, and there are also handouts and booklets and exams that included the restricted mode functions of the PTC system. It's the simulator portion that does not include that restricted mode function.
Okay, thank you. So the simulator had no restricted mode function. when PTC was first implemented, did it have restricted mode, or did they figure out that they needed to come up with another way to be able for crews to do their switching operations?
It was developed with it. Just it's part of the ITMS package when the railroads and the manufacturer went for a type approval from the FRA. It was a built-in function. The railroads didn't enable it at first, and some railroads were actually just disabling the PTC to be able to switch out, do their switching maneuvers. It's been enabled now, and it's being enabled across all railroads now that PTC is more fully implemented across all the lines.
Okay, so let me ask this: with PTC in restricted mode, what does the crew have? What kind of protections does the crew have in the restricted mode?
In restrictive mode, PTC is only reactive to an overspeed violation. That means if they're operating under the restricted speed rule, which requires them to operate at a speed that will allow them to stop within half the range of vision of any obstruction, a rail car, broken rail, or misaligned switch. What the PTC in restricted mode does is it restricts the speed limit of the train or the locomotive to whatever the speed limit is, restricted speed limit for that railroad. On CSX, it was 20 miles an hour. So that's the only enforcement, and it waits for the engineer to violate that, and then it penalizes them.
So it only has speed protection. We have no signal protection in restricted mode. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that's the way they can accomplish the switching maneuvers.
Seems like a limitation to the system. It's kind of unfortunate that PTC was supposed to be a technology backstop to keep from overspeeding or going through a signal, keep from collisions from happening. And now we find that with the deadline just a few months away for PTC implementation, that there's an override to the technology. So I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, you're quite welcome, Member Graham and Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I share in the concern regarding the circumstances surrounding the drug and alcohol testing results for the engineer of the westbound train. The collision occurred a little more than a year ago, and it was immediately clear that alcohol impairment and drug use were factors based on the post-accident toxicology testing. Yet I understand our team learned only last Wednesday that the employee drug and alcohol records that CSX provided for this investigation were incomplete. Post-accident testing for the westbound train engineer was performed 6 hours after the collision. Despite the significant amount of time which had elapsed since the collision, the engineer tested positive for alcohol with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.115. At the time of his testing, the engineer's blood alcohol concentration was 5 times the DOT limit. That, despite, again, the fact he was tested 6 hours after the collision. The engineer also tested positive for inactive marijuana metabolites. Under federal regulations, it is illegal for an engineer to have any amount of marijuana in his or her system at any time. The results of the engineer's post-accident testing are obviously troubling, and they raise questions about the possibility of past drug or alcohol use. But the drug and alcohol testing records provided to us by CSX indicate the engineer of the westbound train had not been subject to drug testing for approximately 10 years. Is that correct?
That is correct. The records, we obtained 2 sets of records. The initial ones just had the drug testing that was from 2004 and 2009. The subsequent information we had was only showed that he had alcohol testing.
So the engineer had not been tested for drugs in a decade, and CSX now tells us, as I understand it, that he received 4 random alcohol tests since 2009. 2 in June of 2009, one in June of 2013, and one in August of 2015. Is that correct?
Yes, that was the additional information that we received. We also received notice that he had a drug test in 2008 that we had not received the record of as well. It was a drug and alcohol testing in 2008.
So again, prior to last Wednesday, CSX was telling us that the engineer had not been tested for either drugs or alcohol in roughly 10 years. And it's only within the last few days that CSX informed us regarding the engineer's random alcohol testing. How confident are we that we now have complete and accurate information regarding the random drug and alcohol testing of the westbound train engineer?
It's an interesting question about confidence. We'll say the materials provided two different ways. So the first report, which only reported the 2 drug and alcohol testing in 2004, 2009, was based on a file they sent up of historical drug testing. And that's why it just contained the 2, and that's what we were working off of. It was subsequent to that, a week before, in terms of discussion, that we were able to obtain from both FRA and CSX a listing of these other causes, these other events of random testing. Personally, given the number of tests that are there, to me that seems like a reasonable number one would anticipate from a random drug testing program. So while I can't speak to their record keeping, I am comfortable with the information that we have received.
Thank you. I want to point out that even with this apparently complete information provided to us by CSX now, it nevertheless appears that the engineer had not been tested for alcohol for at least 5 years. To me, it's concerning that a regulated employee was allowed to operate for 10 years without being tested for drugs and 5 years without being tested for alcohol. Mr. Chairman, I'll have some more questions about this later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Member Chapman. Mr. Hall, I want to thank you and your team for a timely investigation. As you know, when I wonder if we are being timely, I will certainly question that. We try to shoot for investigations being completed within about a year, and here we are right at about 13 months. So thank you and your team for that. Yeah, to see the figures for the level of blood alcohol concentration for this engineer, really those are very sobering figures, and maybe that's a pun intended, but these are awfully troubling figures. And Member Chapman pointed out that the level of the blood alcohol concentration at the time of the collision was computed to be around 0.20. That is, as he pointed out, that's 5 times greater than the allowable by FRA regulations. And if we were to compare that to operating a car, it's 2.5 times the legal limit for operating a car in 49 of the states, and 4 times that if the legal limit for the state of Utah. So what I really want to know, and this might be for Dr. Waters, it might be for Dr. Beaton, but if somebody had a BAC of 0.20, what performance decrements might we expect from that? And I guess there's a variance to that question because it depends on the frequency and their tolerance. But who would like to take a stab at that one?
If you don't mind, Chairman, I will take a stab at that. Yes, I agree with your usual assessment. For the average drinker, an alcohol level of 0.2 is quite impairing in terms of both motor behavior and other changes you would see even in terms of mood and behavioral changes. Truthfully, we do even notice at 0.02, there's been documentation that there is a slight decrement in changes. However, as you've also pointed out, that varies a lot. That's the average condition you would expect, but it does vary a lot in terms of someone's frequency of use and the development of tolerance. And truly, people who are much more habitual drinkers develop both a physiological tolerance as well as a behavioral tolerance. Often you'll find that you have some learned behaviors that the person who is performing it can develop strategies to compensate for the alcohol effects. And unfortunately, if they're in the same environment, they can repeat those actions. It's just that these actions are not readily transferable if you have new conditions. However, again, you can develop the tolerance and the behaviors, and you may not notice that by an average observer.
To the outsider, those behaviors may have been compensated for, but is it safe to say that at that level of BAC that it would have a significant impairing ability?
Yes, this would have an impairing ability. The outward signs of behavior or the fact that he was acting normal is what you would see.
Thank you very much. And again, Dr. Waters, this may be for you, this may be for Dr. Beaton. I believe Dr. Beaton indicated that even though trace of marijuana was detected in the engineer system, but we could not determine whether or not that was an amount to be impairing. Can somebody explain to me why, if you have marijuana apparently in your system, why that does not necessarily mean that it's impairing?
I will handle that question as well, unless Dr. Beaton would like to chime in afterwards. But unfortunately, marijuana, the challenge with marijuana is very variable in terms of how it affects people. Typically, whether ingestion or inhalation, you'll have some of your peak concentrations in your blood of the active metabolite, THC, within the first half hour, and that goes downhill fairly readily. However, people, if they're using it, actually report the effects 1 or 2 hours after they've actually had passed their peak level. Now, that's for the active metabolite. The inactive metabolite is what was detected in this engineer's blood and urine. There was no active metabolite detected in his blood at 6 hours post-accident. So the inactive metabolite will never tell you what kind of therapeutic psychoactive level you would have. So we were unable to determine that. And because of the variability, unlike alcohol, you can't backtrack to say, oh, this reflects what you had 6 hours ago. It's stored in your fat, it's processed differently. There's so many other different parameters that prevent you from appreciating that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm out of time, but it was someone who pointed out that, I guess it was Tom Chapman that pointed out that any marijuana use by any DOT covered employee is illegal. So the fact that whether or not we couldn't determine whether or not it was impairing, it's still illegal for that engineer to have been consuming any amount of alcohol. So we'll go to the second round, and Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it a remarkable statement that the DOT IG deemed that the FRA might be unable to enforce its own regulations regarding drug and alcohol testing. Could somebody give me a little more background on that? I mean, that's a pretty strong statement.
I'll take a shot at answering that. The OIG's report identifies a number of oversight and monitoring problems that often are related to available person power within the ranks to do those audits and enforcement visits. Also, there's some lack of skill that was identified in terms of being able to understand and interpret what some of the problems were, particularly as it related to instances where employees were not made available for the random tests.
What you're saying is that the FRA or some of their staff people weren't competent?
Well, I'm not saying incompetent. I'm saying they're lacking there was a suggestion that there was a lack of sufficient competencies.
I think that's a distinction without a difference, sir. But in any case, what is FRA management doing about this?
FRA has not provided us with a full accounting or disclosure or update to the OIG's report. What we do understand is that there are efforts underway to bring in personnel to better cover the regions where the tests are being performed.
Okay, thank you. What about CSX's management? What are they doing about this?
CSX provided us with some materials. We know that we haven't gotten everything from CSX, but there's a rather comprehensive audit from 2019 that identified a lot of CSX problems. Again, mainly around local management implementation of these test programs. CSX has been going through a number of organizational changes recently. They've also seen a reduction in person power in their mid-level manager ranks. And so we don't have a report from CSX on how they're going to address the latest 2019 audit findings.
One other thing that struck me as kind of interesting is the idea of the confidentiality aspects of who was selected to be tested where and when. And that seems like a loophole that you could drive a truck through. How are the local managers being held accountable? Has CSX said anything about that? Because if you had a relationship with somebody, I mean, it sort of eliminates the surprise factor, or it potentially could.
Well, I don't want to speculate, but there's a number of valid ways in which selection for tests can be biased, or the randomness can somehow be compromised, no doubt. We've developed recommendations to have an independent audit of CSX's process, with the idea that there are a number of potential local factors that may degrade the randomness of the selection process. So we certainly share that concern. We don't have data to suggest that there was any compromise, but it does strike us as unusual given the size of this workforce, the percentages that are being sampled. We recognize that there are going to be some employees that do get missed, but it does seem to be a very accountable process. That is, the regulations require the testing administrators to maintain records. Those records should be reviewed to ensure that every employee that's covered by these regulations has an equal probability of being selected. That should be fairly straightforward to identify without having to initially speculate any mechanisms there. Once we establish that, it's a broader issue.
On paper, all of this sounds very good. In practice, we've had a double management failure, one on the part of FRA and one on the part of CSX. So I guess there's plenty of room for improvement. I see my time is up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Vice Chairman, thank you very much. And Carl, thank you for the hand there, because I am forgetting to time people. So thank you very much. And Member Comedy.
Thank you very much. And just to clarify, FRA did respond to the DOT IG report and accepted all the recommendations and they're implementing the recommendations. But speaking of FRA, they did do a 2016 audit and a 2019 audit of CSX and their drug testing program and a number of other things. And part of the audit said the inspections themselves indicated a number of failures, one of which was CSX failed to test after a qualifying event, meaning something happened and they were required to test. And in this one, and in addition to that, they also found the substance abuse professional follow-up testing plan for a certain employee to have 10 alcohol and drug tests in the first year, 6 alcohol tests in the second year, 8 alcohol tests in the third year, 5 alcohol tests in fourth, and 7 the fifth. None of that was followed up on. And out of the 36 total tests that employee was supposed to have, CSX gave them 5. So what I want to talk about is what's going on with CSX. So, Mr. Payan, what is precision scheduled railroading?
I'll give you a thumbnail sketch, and I'll let Director Hall give you the rest.
Real quick.
Okay. Precision railroading was a new method of railroading that most railroads incorporated to streamline their operations. They got rid of a lot of yards, a lot of middle managers. They cut down on personnel to save money, but they were streamlining. The main objective was to, instead of taking cars, rail cars to yards and switching them out and making them wait till the train was big enough, they kept the train moving by going from main point to main point instead of waysides in between.
And let me sum it up in one sentence. It's a fancy term for doing more with less for railroads.
Yes,
and so CSX responded to FRA's 2019 audit plan and said, due to organizational changes, that in a number of areas, that's what caused these deficiencies in their drug and alcohol program. And they refer to organizational changes that stem back to 2017 and 2018, which was when Hunter Harrison took over CSX and implemented precision scheduled railroading, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, FRA, on a phone call conversation with me, said that a lot was going on with precision scheduled railroading, and the very reason why people were not following up on scheduling random drug and alcohol tests is because people were sending emails within CSX that somebody was not receiving because they were fired. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
That's correct. So precision scheduled railroading, and let me just go over what happened in these 2 years. They slashed jobs. In the first 2 years alone, after CSX implemented precision scheduled railroading, the carrier fired 22% of its equipment maintenance workers, 16% of its train crews, 11% of its maintenance of way employees, numerous road foremen, which are required for training. They reduced maintenance, closed repair shops and yards, cut train frequency to combine them into longer trains. I actually have a consist which shows that a train is 4.5 miles long. In this case, the westbound train was 2 miles long. Hunter Harrison essentially squeezed the life out of this railroad for what? To return billions of dollars to a hedge fund and the shareholders. And in return, it created safety issues. So would you agree that, and maybe this is for Ryan, that precision scheduled railroading impacts safety?
Absolutely, and you can look at that from the training perspective. The fact that the initial PTC training was set up to meet the 2015 deadline. Here we have 5 years that have gone by, and just looking at through a safety management lens, where's the feedback loop? Where is the data from the field that is showing that it's effective? And, you know, when you mention the road foreman positions that have been cut, that's the key component to the 217 efficiency test program that would give you your feedback on if training is actually effective and working.
Correct. And in this case, one of the train crews, I can't remember if it was eastbound or westbound, said he wasn't even efficiency tested.
Exactly.
So I know my time is up, but thank you both. And Mr. Frigo, I'm going to have questions for you on training when we get to the third round.
Yeah, thank you very much, Member Hamady and Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go into the positive train control and talk about it a little bit and ask some questions. The PTC configured eastbound train dispatched with PTC disabled due to a GPS failure. The PTC configured westbound train departed its switching activities in Carey with PTC restricted mode enabled. So we had two trains approaching control point Springs from two different directions on the same track. My question is, what PTC protections did either or both trains have as they approached head-on?
The eastbound train was still operating under signal indication, and it was routed from the single main to the number 2 main. And he was operating properly, even with PTC cut out. PTC would not have done anything to prevent this accident. The train was operating properly, diverging into the second main. The westbound train, because it was in restricted mode, was not enforcing signal indications. Had the PTC been in active mode, the westbound train would have been stopped before being able to violate that red signal.
Thank you. So we had no signal or switching protections on either train coming in to that switch. Is that correct?
On the eastbound train, it was just like regular everyday signal indication. It was upon the crew to adhere to the signal indications.
So PTC in this case would not have helped in any case for this collision.
For the eastbound train, for the westbound train, it would have stopped before violating that red signal had he been in active mode.
Yeah, but in this case, PTC didn't help out at all.
Not in restricted mode, yes, sir.
So we have a limitation with PTC restricted mode enabled out there. My question now is, do all the other freight railroads and passenger railroads that have PTC, do they have the same restricted mode? Is that a good question for you?
It is. It's the railroads that use the IETMS, the Interoperable Electronic Train Management System, for their PTC that have this feature enabled. Such as Amtrak on the Northeast Corridor uses Access. They don't use the same restricted mode.
Okay. Do they have a similar limitation to where they could get stuck in a restricted mode and not have all the protections of PTC?
From my understanding, the restricted mode is more for switching operations on main line track. Amtrak doesn't really do, well, they don't to switch out cars on main track. They're more passenger point to point.
Okay. What about the other Class 1 freight railroads?
All the Class 1 railroads are using IETMS, and restricted mode is a feature enabled for all Class 1s.
Okay. So we have a limitation in restricted mode. Are there any recommendations that the team has for the board to adopt to improve the technology when in a restricted mode?
Once the railroads develop it, we weren't in a position to dictate to the railroads if it should be time-based or distance-based before requiring the engineer to acknowledge if he wanted to continue in restricted mode. So the railroads are developing this, and once they do, it'll become standard for all railroads. Since it's an IETMS common parameter, it'll be the same for all railroads once the discussion or the decision is made on how to fix it.
Okay, so we've got, I'm concerned about that. Train collisions and overspeed derailments are often due to human factors such as fatigue, sleep disorders, use of drugs, alcohol in this case, distractions including use of cell phones. Because of these lapses in human performance, PTC was designed and mandated to be a full fail-safe engineering control. Correct. However, due to the limitations of PTC in this case, now allowing for switching PTC has to allow somehow for activities, switching activities. Restricted mode was created. So this introduced an administrative control exposing PTC back to human error.
Yes.
And I think this collision highlights the current vulnerabilities to PTC, and it opens up opportunities for improvement. And I think maybe it's just the engineer in me, but maybe I don't think having the human, constantly hitting the display, allowing them to go in restricted mode to go forward is the way to fix this technology-wise. I would like to see if there's some way that there can be switch protection and signal protection while in restricted mode to take the human failure out of this. So I think it's worth looking at, and I see my time is up. Thank you.
Member Graham, thank you very much. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few additional questions about the drug and alcohol testing issues. A proposed recommendation we'll consider today would call on DOT to direct an independent audit of the CSX drug and alcohol testing program to determine the circumstances that allowed a regulated employee to operate for an extended time period without being subjected to random testing. And I agree that a serious evaluation of the CSX program is warranted, but it's unclear what sort of independent audit, at least to me, unclear what sort of independent audit is anticipated in this proposed recommendation. Are we calling on the DOT Inspector General to audit the program? And if so, should the recommendation state explicitly that the Inspector General should direct the audit?
I'll let Dr. Beaton answer that.
Okay, I'll start the answer off here. We are asking for an independent audit since we've had concerns about FRA's abilities based on the information that we've received. So we've looked to go one level higher in the DOT organization and make that recommendation to the Secretary. That's been a rare situation for us to make a recommendation to the Secretary where, because we're asking for an independent audit, the expectation is that that will be performed by the OIG. But I'm not sure we can make a recommendation directly to the OIG. I could also ask Director Hall if he might want to add to that answer.
Our safety recs group did a search of past recommendations, and it hasn't been, I believe, since the early 70s that we've actually tried making a recommendation directly to the Inspector General. It has been the practice in such things where we want something independent of one of the modal offices at DOT to go to the office of the Secretary and ask for an audit. The expectation is that the Secretary would assign that to the IG, but I could also envision the Secretary assigning that to one of the other modal offices within DOT. I think the important thing is that it be looked at independent of the FRA, since we have all the documented issues with the FRA's process that were documented in the IG report.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. And I assumed that referring this to the IG is what was anticipated, and it seems like that's the obvious path. But I also understand that there are some procedural questions there too. But it's certainly worth emphasizing that this should be done. It should be done well. Should be done independently. And if that's the Inspector General, then so be it. The engineer of the Westbound train again apparently avoided drug testing for approximately 10 years, random alcohol testing for approximately 5 years by my calculation. It's my understanding that engineers and other regulated employees are recertified periodically, and I'm not a railroad guy, so please correct me if I'm wrong here, but in the case of engineers, I believe the time frame for recertification is every 3 years. Should there be a requirement that testing for alcohol and drugs must occur no less frequently than at the time a regulated employee is recertified?
I'll start the answer, and now maybe I'll ask Dr. Beaton or Ryan to chime in. The random program is supposed to be random, and I think identifying employees that way would hinder the randomness of the tests. But yes, the engineers are recertified every 3 years. Dr. Beaton, or do you have anything to add?
I would simply add that I think a programmatic evaluation, hopefully it comes as a result of the independent audit, to look at the efficiency of CSX program in particular, and which may be generalized across the industry to other railroads. But the sampling rates that we have, 25%, 10%, what have you, I'm not as confident as DOT appears to be that those are sufficient. And so the technical data, the science behind the effectiveness of drug and alcohol programs as a deterrent needs to be clearly established. There is an ongoing body of research that suggests that there are issues there, but I think a government audit of its ongoing programs would be called for, looking specifically at how effective these programs are. If they're not effective, then perhaps increasing the frequency or increasing the amount, the number of tests that are performed is one way to get at that. But I wouldn't want to just suggest that we put a time limit on there that may in fact further influence or degrade the randomness of the selection process.
And if you don't mind, Member Chapman, I'll chime in a little bit as well.
Sure.
The triennial testing you're referring to in terms of medical certification really is only for hearing and vision. So we agree, while that's limited in terms of potentially other medical issues that may arise, that's the burden of reporting that is truly on the employee to say, hey, I have diabetes, I have some other impairing condition. So that triennial evaluation is for hearing and vision. As far as the drug testing goes, at least for CSX, and I'm sure for other railroads, there's other times that drug testing is performed, including if they have a post-offer for the pre-employment, but when they're transferring between crafts, or if they're off work for medical reasons or for furlough reasons for an extended period, they do have other opportunities for drug and alcohol, or particularly drug testing on those times. So we can essentially, the requirement of having a mandated testing will defeat the purpose of the concept of deterrence, particularly if you have a scheduled appointment, you prepare for them. For example, even with pre-employment, you may not catch people because they've chosen to avoid, sustaining from one of the alcohol or substance of abuse for the month prior, knowing that they're having testing. So it is a challenge in terms of trying to capture that. And as I said, right now, there are other opportunities, including for cause, for suspicion, that can come to the notice and have the person tested.
Thank you. I'm way over time. I apologize, Mr. Chairman, but I do think I do hope that an audit will yield some ideas here for how to increase the effectiveness of the random testing. Thank you.
Member Chapman, thank you very much. And so let me talk for a moment just about restricted mode. Sort of in checking around, it appears, Mr. Frago, that this was not widely known within the crafts of engineers and conductors and even signal employees. What has your investigation revealed about that, about how widespread and how understood restricted mode may have been?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. You're right. When you look at the interviews, 50%, half of who we interviewed were familiar with it, and the other half were not as familiar with it. And to me, again, this goes back to training. It really goes back to understanding what is going on within that training program and that feedback loop to understand how what individuals receive in training is then implemented in the field. One point I want to make is that there was an audit conducted on the efficiency test program by FRA, and that was in August of 2019. The summary of that audit included the fact that, and I'm going to read right from the audit, FRA's audit revealed a lack of operational testing on operations on CSX's main lines and areas outside of their main terminals and yards. Right there is your feedback loop, where you would learn about what is actually being implemented and how effective that training is.
Yeah, thank you very much. But the reality is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, despite not a lot of knowledge by the operating crews for restricted mode, the reality is the locomotive engineer could not have taken the train out of restricted mode, because before doing so, he had to be able to update the PTC system with the train consist in terms of the length and the weight. Is that true?
Well, one of the things the common practice that this team, I'll call it a team because this engineer and conductor working together as a team, they stated their common practice was to do this in person together in the cab. However, the engineer does have a train sheet as part of his paperwork. And by going down the train sheet and crossing off the cars that have been removed from that train, he could have established what the new tonnage requirements were and entered, into active mode once again.
So how much math was involved in that? I mean, if it's just simply a matter of crossing off car 31, 32, 37, 38, but does he or she have to do the math to then come up with the tonnage?
Each line item actually gives you, once you eliminate, it gives you that new tonnage of the full train. So okay. It's really crossing out and lining up in the right spot.
Thank you very much for that. I've just got about a minute more. CSX, to their credit, they have installed inward-facing cameras or image recorders in about 700 of their 1,800 locomotives, and I want to recognize that. There's no requirement for them to do that, and so let me give credit there. Unfortunately, it was not on this lead locomotive. Do we have any idea at all how much longer before CSX do they have plans to continue updating their lead locomotives, those locomotives that would potentially be used in a lead position? How long before they would update the rest of their fleet of locomotives? Any idea at all?
Yes, we included that information in the draft report. They have a fleet of about 1,800 locomotives, road locomotives that are on the road, and they have committed to equipping more this year. And their goal is to 2022, I believe, to have the entire road fleet outfitted with inward-facing cameras.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I will pause right there, and I tell you what, we will go one more round. And then we'll take a break after that. So, Vice Chairman Landsberg, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on your question, our recommendation FRA to the FRA R10-1, so that's 10 years old now, recommended requiring crash-protected inward and outward-facing cameras on all front-end locomotives. And yet the regulations only require that for passenger trains. Do we have any sense as to why the FRA may have not why they've resisted that and not enacted it, because collisions, I think, are equal opportunity problems. And if a freight train is not being managed properly and the inward-facing camera isn't there, it doesn't really matter if it collides with a passenger train. You still have a potential for major loss of life.
Yes, sir. Kara from our Safety Recommendations Office can walk you through a history and how we got to where we're at.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes. So over the course of about 10 years, as you mentioned, there's been varying responses from FRA about this recommendation. And in that time, we've reiterated the recommendation 6 times and issued it to additional stakeholders. So as things change, their responses changed. The initial response cited concerns about unwarranted publication of private conversations and erosion of working relationships between employees and managers. A follow-up response a year later, in about 2011, they cited selective enforcement and labor opposition as concerns. And after we reiterated the recommendation 3 more times from the period of 2012 to 2013, and that was because of 3 more freight accidents, they responded that they would work with the RSAC committee, the Safety Advisory Committee, to come up with technical requirements for cameras. After several years, RSAC was unable to establish those requirements. They were unable to basically come to a consensus on what they should be. And so it's important to note that during that time that RSAC was working, there were additional accidents, 2 more accidents, in which we reiterated the recommendation 2 more times to FRA. And we also issued recommendations similar to FTA and to Amtrak, 2015 and 2017. And so this pretty much brings us to 2019 now. Following the Amtrak derailment, we issued another recommendation to the DOT secretary. And this recommendation was to require that the FRA act on 10-001 and 2. So in 2019, FRA did issue the NPRM, which we already covered. Ryan Frigo covered that earlier. The NPRM does not apply to freight operations, as you mentioned, even though freight was 5 of the 6 previous accidents were involved freight. So that was the correspondence history. And then there was also their statement in their NPRM, which is different than what was covered in their correspondence history. The FRA statement and its NPRM are somewhat differing, because it states it is declining to impose a requirement to install recording devices on freight locomotives at this time for practical reasons other than for legal reasons. They cited the explicit statutory mandate from the FAST Act and 2-year implementation deadline as a concern, the lack of corresponding statutory mandate for freight locomotives, and the possibility that the cost of implementing such a requirement for freight locomotives could outweigh its positive safety benefits, and that's directly from their language, and the fact that many freight railroads are already in the process of voluntarily installing their recording devices, even though there is no mandate.
Thank you for a very comprehensive answer. It doesn't encourage me particularly that FRA is dealing with the safety aspects of this. And quite frankly, when we talk about cost benefit, this particular crash, I believe, was somewhere just a little bit shy of $5 million. That would allow you to equip an awful lot of locomotives. And if you collide with a passenger train, with a freight train, you're going to have a major, major expense. So thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes my time for this round. Thank you.
Vice Chairman, thank you very much. Member Hamady.
Thank you very much. Mr. Frigo, I have questions for you on training. So train crews get a 4-hour training class on PTC, which includes time on the simulator, which Member Graham talked about. And he also asked you if PTC restricted mode was on the simulator. It's not. And PTC restricted mode, I think, is about 2 years old right now. The simulator that the train crews use, is it generic, or is it is it configured so it is their territory?
So that's a great question. So there are both programs available within that simulator. We do know that initially the training that was offered was on the generic routes. This still would include your PTC functions, PTC initialization, responding to commands en route, negotiating through mandatory directives and work zones. However, CSX has started to transition over to route-specific, so territory-specific modules within that simulator training.
But until now, they've all had a generic simulator
route.
time.
Correct.
And I've used CSX's simulator, so I am familiar with what the screen looks like. And if you do not, so you have the simulator, you have the simulator test, you have annual training, which will include some, if you're efficiency tested, which you're supposed to be, it'll include some questions on PTC, but really there are a lot of questions on the operating rules. And outside of that, locomotive engineers are expected to know what their operating rules are.
That's correct. I mean, they are responsible for the safe operation of that train.
Okay, so this is what I want to get into, because when a locomotive engineer boards a train, they have to have with them, I have a list of the materials I looked up, which comes from a CSX bulletin from June 2020, so it's pretty recent. They have to have with them, if they are not familiar, if they did not receive adequate training and they are not familiar with something, they have to look it up in one of the following: CSX Operating Rules, CSX Safeway, which is their safety rules, CSX Equipment Handling Rules, CSX Air Brake Train Handling Rules, Hazmat Rules. They have to have all their previous rule books with them, according to that bulletin. Then you have to have all your system bulletins. Then you have to have your daily bulletins. Then you have to have the timetable. Then you have to have not just the timetable for that territory, but any other territory that you're operating in on that day. That is a lot to carry. In fact, there was one accident, we didn't investigate it, I don't believe, where a train crew was actually looking up the rules when they rear-ended another train. So I find it interesting that I continue to hear issues with training on PTC. And so I know that CSX issued another system bulletin after this accident, dated August 15th, 2019. And it talks about, at the beginning of it, the PTC system is designed to monitor and stop a train in 4 instances. It talks about the job briefing, which was referenced in the PowerPoint presentation, although I'd say the job briefing does not specifically call out a briefing on restricted mode. It calls out discussions on PTC. But interestingly, they added a section on restricted mode, which says, immediately after completing all switching moves and updating all required consist changes, the locomotive operator must turn off restricted mode prior to making initial movement to depart location. Here's my question. If you're not properly trained and you read that somewhere in your 15-page document for the hundreds of pages that you're required to take on the train, don't you think it's important that CSX say why you should come out of PTC restricted mode in that document? If CSX is going to say why you have PTC, maybe they should also tell the crew why it's important that they immediately come out of restricted mode.
That's a great point. And a strong training program with strong trainers would do that. And I just want to clarify one point that I made earlier, that I'm just looking at my notes, and the simulator program since 2014 has the ability to upload PTC routes within it. So that ability has been there since 2014.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am out of time. I appreciate it, and have other questions for other rounds.
Thank you very much, Member Hamady and Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to pick up with that training left off there. Did the crew really receive restricted mode training in the classroom, or were they made aware of it through a CSX bulletin that restricted mode was enabled, or how it worked?
So within the training records, there are questions on the exams that are given that cover restricted mode. So it is covered as part of the classroom training curriculum.
Okay. Do we know how many bulletins came out about restricted mode from CSX?
I don't have that answer offhand, but there is also a PTC quick reference guide that was provided, and within that reference guide, there is also information. Restricted mode is also covered within that reference guide.
Okay. Well, I was just a little confused going through the interviews with both engineers and both conductors. I think maybe they didn't have a really clear understanding of restricted mode. They didn't quite get the speeds right, but I know that's variable. But I think only one of them actually stated that they were aware that there was no signal protection.
Right.
And the other one, which is a concern, which again leads me back to PTC. And it's designed to be an engineering control. And I'm just concerned now that we have a restricted mode for all the Class 1 railroads. We'll be operating on tracks that the passenger trains also run on, and the fact that they also carry the hazardous materials and put communities at risk with the collisions and mis-switching or whatever could happen in this case, that somehow now we are bringing the human back in here, and we're going to rely. Why are we relying on the human to be the fail-safe system for the limited technology that was designed to take the historical failures of the human out of the equation here? So I'm just very concerned that PTC is not as robust a system as we were hoping for. So I think there's some real concern there. So I'd like to switch modes here just a little bit and probably talk with Dr. Waters here a little bit about one. I know we talked a lot about drug and alcohol, and can you elaborate a little bit about how we determine elimination rate for alcohol?
Thank you, Member Gorham. We did not determine the elimination rate for alcohol. We used that an average person or moderate drinkers rate. So we used a quantity that was 0.015 grams of alcohol per deciliter per hour. In contrast, if you were a naive drinker, or very casual, you might have used 0.01. If you were a heavy drinker, you might have 0.035. So what's typically used for a moderate drinker or standard average person is somewhere around 0.015, and that's the number we use to back calculate. We can draw the same slope using those other elimination rates to determine, yeah, we think this guy heavy, we should have higher, and yes, indeed, he would have a higher level 6 hours prior to the testing. However, regardless, we feel he was intoxicated, he was impaired both at the time of the testing as well as the time of the accident.
Thank you for that. And I thank you for your earlier answers about active and inactive metabolites when it comes to marijuana and THC. I didn't understand that, and I was going to ask that question, but I'm glad you clarified it earlier. So without being able to determine whether someone who tests positive for the inactive marijuana metabolite and who was impaired by marijuana, what challenges does this present for local and state law officers enforcing driving under the influence of marijuana?
Good question. You will obviously, states vary in terms of their use and allowance for marijuana, whether they've just decriminalized it versus have it for medicinal, have it for recreational. And all of them have the challenge of how you judge impairment. Some of them do on the street testing for impairment, different measures that they do training of their officers. But many of the states, what they have are per se laws where they set a number, and if you have this in your system, you're assumed to be impaired, even though there actually isn't a direct correlation between it. So they have used per se laws for that, and they vary by state as well. However, do point out that with DOT, it's 0 for both the inactive and the active metabolites.
Understood. Thank you. I'm going to come back in my next round with one more question on that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're quite welcome, Member Graham and Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some questions about PTC and administrative versus engineering controls. This is regarding a solution to avoid inappropriate use of PTC restricted mode. The draft report emphasizes that engineering controls are more effective than administrative controls, and that was stressed again here today in the staff presentation. And as you know, one of the formal recommendations we'll consider today appropriately calls for improved engineering controls that will automatically limit the use of PTC restricted mode on main tracks. While I agree that engineering controls are more effective, I believe we should encourage operators to implement interim improvements through administrative controls, particularly if there's going to be a delay in implementing a permanent engineering control. For instance, the draft report notes that administrative controls have been CSX through a revised PTC bulletin. Now, I don't know how good those controls are, but at least there's been an effort there to implement some kind of an interim solution. How confident are we that the engineering controls currently in the works will be implemented in a timely fashion?
The ITC committee through CSX has set a date of the fourth quarter of this year to come up with a solution. They're still debating whether what exactly the software solution is going to be, but they have CSX at least informed us that they are shooting for the fourth quarter of this year to start implementing a software change.
And is there any downside to encouraging operators to pursue some kind of an interim administrative control along the lines of those which CSX has apparently adopted?
We when we met with you, we did take note of that concern that you voiced, and we did reach out to other railroads to inquire what exactly their rules say, and I'll let Mr. Frigo give you a summary of what he found out.
So again, with regard to the rules and to me, it goes back to observations. It really goes back to how do we know what's working in the field? And without that effective efficiency testing part of it, it's really hard to know. I mean, it's, and again, within that draft report and seeing the administrative controls, rules and procedures, that's a scary thing to rely on. And if you're going to rely on the rules and procedures, you must ensure that your program for overseeing their correct and effective implementation is top notch. And you have to constantly measure the effectiveness of that program. It just doesn't end on the day that you develop the programmatic documents and send it out to your management in the field. It's a constant process. And, you know, unfortunately, until there is an engineering control in place, we're in this area of vulnerability. And that's just something that the industry needs to be cognitive of.
Well, thank you for that. And I think that's consistent with where I am on this. I want to draw operators' attention to this. Too often in transportation, we've seen the best of intentions delayed by unanticipated obstacles. And sometimes that's related to technology, sometimes it's related to funding, sometimes to other unanticipated factors. Administrative controls aren't a perfect solution. And heck, I was a music major in college, so you don't want me dealing with engineering controls. But I do believe there's value to these measures, at least on a short-term basis, while work continues to develop appropriate engineering controls. Certainly, we don't want to just leave this as an open issue without some effort to try to address it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you very much. Appreciate that. Dr. Waters, you mentioned, I think you said that when figuring the rate of metabolism for various levels of drinkers, for novice drinkers, it might be 0.01, maybe for moderate, it might be 0.02. For heavy drinkers, it might be 0.035 or something like that. I may have gotten the numbers wrong, but bottom line is that if this locomotive engineer had this amount of alcohol in his system 6 hours after the collision, would it be safe to assume that he was not a moderate drinker? He would have been a heavy drinker. Otherwise, he may have been close to being dead with that amount of alcohol in his system. I mean, do you think that? I realize we can't exactly say whether or not he was a heavy drinker or a moderate drinker, but is it safe to assume that based on his behavior, he may have been a heavy drinker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say, based on what we've seen, his ability to present himself that no one was suspicious of his drinking, one would suspect that he was a heavy drinker, or at least more a habitual drinker. I did back calculate to say what kind of concentration would this gentleman have, how much would he have had to have drunk, assuming he even drank it in one sitting prior to the accident. And it amounts to about 375 mils or pint of some kind of bourbon is what he would have had to consume. So that's about 12 ounces or so. So yes, to have consumed that in a short period of time does suggest that you are a seasoned drinker. To have had that spread over a course of time as well as to enjoy that might be also considered that. And obviously that's based on the time of the accident. If you go further back, you would have had to have consumed more to have been at the level at the time of the accident.
Yeah, so if in fact he was a seasoned drinker, a heavy drinker, his metabolism, a typical person who drinks heavily would have a metabolism of, what'd you say, about 0.035?
That is one of the numbers given for people who have much more chronic drinkers. Again, it's a supposed value based on all sorts of other factors that come into play.
So when you came up with the figure that you extrapolated out what his level of BAC was at the time of the collision, I think you based your figures on a moderate drinker. Is that correct?
That is correct. I based it on a moderate drinker because we had no other real solid input to say, determine one way or the other.
If you use the 0.035 for a seasoned drinker, what would his BAC be? Have you done the math on that one?
Yes, I did the math on that. So at the time of the accident, his blood alcohol would have been about 0.325, somewhere around there, at the time of the accident. So it would have been around closer to 0.3.
That's what I was afraid of. So we've already sort of established that based on his ability to conceal, somewhat conceal his impairment, that he may well have been a heavy drinker. And if that's the case, his BAC would have been closer to 0.3 as opposed to 0.2. And that, do people, it seems like I've read figures that if somebody has that level of impairment, they could ostensibly die, or that level of BAC.
That is for more the naive drinker. In my conversations with our medical officer, Dr. McKay, we were talking about her emergency room cases, and she had many instances where people came in appearing somewhat sober and they were above 0.4. She reports someone who is at 0.7 and they still recovered successfully from their alcohol withdrawal. So
interesting. Thank you very much. So I don't have any further questions. We will take a break, but we will resume the rounds of questions once we do return from the break. So before going into the break, I would like to invite all participants to turn off your cameras and your microphones, and we will resume at 11:35. So that is about 14 minutes from now. We are in recess. And we're back in session, and we'll begin with the next round of questions. And Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Member Chapman mentioned about administrative controls and how they are imperfect, but they're probably the best thing that we have, particularly when we have developing automation such as PTC. And my question, I guess, or maybe it's a statement, is if you don't measure something, it makes it really hard to manage, maybe impossible. So how would CSX or any railroad company know if their procedures were being followed as regards to PTC and some of the other safety briefings and things of that sort? And on those locomotives where there are inward-facing cameras, do any of the railroads have a random monitoring and correction, and I want to be very clear, not punishment program, to ensure that their crews are following the procedures?
I'll start real quick, and then I'll pass it off to Ryan Frigo. But as far as the PTC, one thing we have to remember is this system is brand new, and it's still not fully certified. The railroad, CSX, is in the revenue service demonstration part in preparation for their final safety plan, which will certify the system. So right now they're gathering data, as like you said, on trying to measure what works best and what doesn't, and that's going to go into their safety plan, which gets submitted for final certification from FRA. Mm-hmm. As far as the cameras, I'll turn that over to Mr. Frigo.
Thank you, Mr. Payan. So the cameras are only part of it. I'd like to answer your question in two ways. The first part of it is, how do you measure, how do you measure the effectiveness of following administrative controls such as rules and procedures in the field? That's all done through the Part 217 program, which is the efficiency test program. And what that basically consists of are middle managers, road foremen, verifying that rules are being followed in the field. And that information provides feedback to management, again, on what should be refocused on for the overall training program, but also for those individual engineers. I had the opportunity in October last October to go to Indianapolis and attend a CSX middle management training course. And the one thing that really was clear to me from that training course was the fact that CSX extremely focused on ensuring that middle managers know how to interact with employees in a positive way. And this is when we speak about railroad and the history of railroad, there's a lot of discipline. The word discipline comes up. And I can tell you from this training that CSX is shifting away from that. They're trying to learn from those mistakes. They want to know about those close calls. They want to know from their employees what is going on. And then they want to use that information to make positive improvement. The second part of my answer is you asked about the use of cameras. So CSX does have the ability to tap into their onboard camera system to validate that engineers and conductors, so train crew members, are doing what they need to do. And it's our understanding that that information is being used to provide positive feedback and to get, again, this feedback loop to improve their program. So, as Ruben mentioned, with PTC being, in the initial implementation stages, they're working on it. And, although there were some training retention issues that we are seeing from the crew members, I can tell you, based on the management training that I attended, they're focused on that. They are.
Good. Well, that's encouraging. Mr. Chairman, that's my last question. Thank you.
Vice Chairman, thank you very much. And it was a very interesting answer given by Mr. Frigo. So thank you very much. And Member Hamady, you're next.
Thank you very much. I want to shift to PTC, and this may be Mr. Payan or Mr. Frigo. PTC is designed to do 4 things: prevent train-to-train collisions, overspeed derailments, incursions into established work zones, and movements through a switch left in the wrong position. I want to, and right now the deadline for PTC implementation is less than 100, it's about 100 days away from now, on December 31st, 2020. Now, what I want to ask about is the eastbound train. So in interviews, the eastbound crew report for duty at 1:40 a.m. on August 12th in Garrett, Indiana. When they get on the locomotive, they reported in the interviews that PTC was not active because the previous crew had reported an en route failure. Why? And so what happens at that moment when a crew gets on, or even en route, there's a failure? In this case, it was a GPS failure, and PTC is no longer active.
Okay, for the accident crew that reported to Garrett, Indiana, the PTC system was already disabled or cut out. Yep. So when they took possession of the train or custody of the train to start moving towards Columbus, before they could proceed, they had to check in with the dispatcher, notify him that the PTC was cut out, get permission from the dispatcher, and then proceed with a PTC cutout with a speed restriction imposed on them because they did not have PTC.
Right. And stay on for a second. So the speed restriction was about 49 miles per hour, correct?
Correct.
And so when you say PTC is cut out, that means PTC is not on. It's not working at that moment. So at that point, they are governed by operating rules, special instructions, timetable instructions, and signal indications, correct?
Correct.
Communications with the dispatcher. That a little bit, but that's what's governing their operations at that point.
Yes, ma'am.
And so the 49 mile per hour, that was a speed restriction, you said?
Yes.
Have we investigated accidents at about 49 miles per hour or under where PTC could have prevented an accident from happening?
More numerous than I can think of.
Yeah, yes. Graniteville, South Carolina is a big one. 2 freight railroads, Norfolk Southern trains, hit each other, and they were transporting chlorine, and 9 people died as a result of it, and they were going maybe somewhere between 40 and 49 at the time, and they hit a stationary train, and we determined it was PTC preventable. So at this point, the crew, the eastbound train crew, which didn't do anything wrong, I want to make that clear, but the eastbound, but what I'm trying to get at is risk here. So the eastbound train crew leaves in Garrett, Indiana, and they have no PTC. It's cut out. And so because there was a GPS failure, are these GPS failures, or well, not just GPS, are these failures occurring pretty frequently throughout the rail network right now?
I don't know about the frequency, but it is common enough to have procedures in place for when they do happen. So
there are actually reports where it is occurring frequently as they move towards implementation, as they find little bugs in the technology that they need to get fixed, maybe from Wabtec, their supplier, or somebody else, and until it's fixed, they cut it out. And so how long was this eastbound train moving, how many miles, until they were supposed to get PTC fixed?
The next forward repair facility for locomotives was Columbus, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And I believe the report mentions 180 miles? 180
miles. So they were going 180 miles without PTC. These bugs have been happening throughout the rail network, not just in the Columbus subdivision. And here we had 2 freight trains, and the Columbus subdivision has not had passenger traffic on it since 1971 when Penn Central was operating on it. But certainly, if you're on a passenger train, I know my time is up, but I'll end with this. If you're on a passenger train, although they are not doing switching right now, they are reporting still these bugs. What happens if you have a GPS failure? Are they cutting out?
They have to. If they cannot initialize the PTC system, they can't move. So they have to cut it out after receiving permission.
And does this problem magically go away on December 31st, or is that just the deadline to implement PTC?
That's the deadline to implement PTC.
Thank you very much. I'll come back with some questions on restricted mode.
Thank you, Member Hamady and Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to some marijuana questions, or one question here for a minute. I know with more states legalizing the use of marijuana, the NTSB will continue to investigate accidents where the toxicology report shows inactive marijuana metabolites. Although each mode has laws and regulations against marijuana impairment, it still prevents us from understanding whether the engineer, a driver, a captain, or a pilot was under the influence of marijuana at the time of the accident. So I have a question for Dr. Waters. Are we aware of any technology on the horizon that will assist not just us, but more importantly, law enforcement officers in determining marijuana impairment?
Thank you for that question, Member Graham. The question isn't so much of determining impairment, the tests that you're referring to. The challenge is still, you have more ways of testing. We're going to do hair testing. We're going to do saliva testing. We're on the spot saliva to get a number. The question will still be, does that suggest impairment? So my understanding is that the police officers in general are using other signs of impairment, behavioral signs, to make their case to bring someone in to have whatever testing done. Regardless, the results right now, there's more research needed in terms of looking at what does that mean in terms of levels. The variability is still there, so it's difficult to say this number means you're impaired or not. And that still persists. It would be helpful to have more research done in terms of looking at that, but that is a challenge in terms of looking at marijuana and marijuana laws. I do want to point out that in the FRA post-accident testing, the active metabolite was also tested for, and it was not found at 6 hours. Only the inactive metabolites was found. However, even if we had the number for the active metabolite at 6 hours after the fact, would not have been as suggestive. It's really the numbers really immediately post ingestion or inhalation of the marijuana that would actually be terribly high. So just want to make sure it's clear that he was tested based up for FRA. Post-accident testing did include the active metabolite, and it was negative.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate that. I just wanted to point out a couple things. I know we talked a lot about the Federal Rail Administration's issues and their ability to oversee audits and of the drug and alcohol testing. Of the last two audits they did of CSX, I think the first one back in 2016, we really didn't have any documentation on that. And then the last one that their audit on May 6th through the 10th of 2019, it took them almost 1 year to get the report to CSX. When I was in aviation, an aviation operation, the audits, I would hope that CSX at least knew about their discrepancies before the auditors left the scene, but to take a year to get them an audit report, I mean, I always saw my own within maybe a couple weeks, a month after. That's disturbing. And then I know we already talked about some of the results of this, that FRA was concerned to learn that there were significant failures in completing federally required random follow-up and completing post-accident testing when required. I know one of the statements in the random collection process findings was, in general, it appears that there has been significant decline since the last audit in completing random collections. I'm just very concerned for CSX that I hope they're taking this seriously. The way I always looked at federal regulations they were the minimum standard. And, I would hope that CSX would reach above the minimum standard, reach well above it, because just okay is not good enough in this case. And I see my time's up, and Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have.
Member Graham, thank you very much. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one last question before I pose it. I do want to thank everyone for their patience and for their excellent answers this morning. Very helpful to all of us. My last question is this: during our recent meeting to discuss the investigation, it was stressed that an engineer running a stop signal is a major event and will typically trigger an investigation. If this event had not resulted in a collision with another train, what would have happened to the engineer? Would there have been an investigation, and would he have been tested for alcohol and drugs? And I recognize this is somewhat speculative, but any information you can provide would be helpful.
I'll let Mr. Frigo from Operations start us off, if that's okay.
Thank you, Mr. Payan. So a red signal violation is as bad as you get without causing, a major incident. And, according to the internal investigative procedures at CSX, that would have triggered an internal investigation. It's, that involves management and, frontline management, and that would make its way to headquarters. And it would be something that would be scrutinized and looked at. And, it's taken very seriously because it's, as you said, it's a cardinal sin. It's as bad as you can get before, creating an event. The drug and alcohol component of it, I would have to ask one of my colleagues if they could answer that part of it for you.
Thanks.
it might be helpful if you could repeat for us what the concern on the drug and alcohol aspect.
Yeah, just a question. If this were an event that had not resulted in an accident, the train, the engineer runs a red signal, runs a stop signal. There's no accident, but it presumably triggers an investigation. Would there also have been drug and alcohol testing? And is that something, if there is that something that would be determined by company policy, or is that something that's determined by federal regulation?
Well, I think my first response to that would be, depending upon the circumstances, of course, that the managers, the CSX managers involved that would respond to that incident could make that determination. That is, if there was no accident, but this was just a behavioral event where a rule was violated, a signal was passed at danger, the manager that's reported to would make the determination if a drug and alcohol test would be required.
So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is, had this accident not occurred, had there been a stop signal violated but no accident, there's at least a possibility that this engineer would not have been tested for drugs and alcohol, and we might not have known that there was a problem with this particular individual. Again, speculative, I know, but just wanted to underscore that. Mr. Chairman, that's my last question. Thank you.
Member Chapman, thank you very much. I do not have any further questions, and I understand Member Hamady has questions to any of my colleagues. I think you've all indicated no further questions at this point. So with that in mind, Member Hamady, I'm going to recognize you for 10 minutes. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Payan, my questions are largely going to be for you. So go ahead and turn on your camera, if you don't mind. The question I have is on switching operations. And so what I want to make sure people who are watching understand what really was going on with restricted mode here. So during switching operations, you can't actually stop and reverse. Your train's just not going to move. And so if the crew, if there was no such thing as restricted mode, if it was never created, what would the railroads be doing?
They would be disengaging or cutting out the PTC with absolutely no protection at all, no overspeed at all.
In fact, some of the crew members reported that in the yards, that's still what's going on, that instead of actually moving it into restricted mode, people are still cutting out PTC so they can make some moves and make up some trains. And so on a passenger route, you might not have switching movements because you have train sets. You might, though, have to switch out a locomotive because something broke down. If you did have to do anything, what would you likely do? Would you go into a restricted mode, or would you just probably cut out?
It depends on the railroad operating rules. If they are using restricted mode, they'll have instructions for that. If they don't teach their engineers or opt to enable the restricted mode, then they would have to cut it out and switch out the locomotives or do whatever switching is required.
And again, cutouts are, there's no PTC. So in restricted mode, so we learned earlier, you have 4 things that PTC protects. So out of these, when you are in restricted mode, does it prevent all train-to-train collisions?
No, I mean,
no.
It only.
Does it prevent incursions into established work zones?
No.
No. Does it prevent movements through a switch left in the wrong position?
No.
And does it prevent overspeed derailments?
Yes, restricted speed, yes.
It can, right. So you have a situation where they built into the system, which is something Member Graham was getting at, a system that a process that they believed was addressing a problem, but in effect, they added the potential for yet another human failure. And so now they are looking at a fix and through this committee. How do we fix this problem? So how does the fix work that they're looking at?
So when a train goes into, when train PTC system is placed in restricted mode, once it starts moving forward, and right now there's two options that are being discussed, the one that was presented to us by CSX and the one that was offered up by another railroad. Once the locomotive starts moving forward in restricted mode, after a certain distance, a prompt will come up on the monitor that the engineer has to acknowledge. Do you want to continue in restricted mode? If the engineer ignores the prompt, he will go into a penalty brake application. If he acknowledges it, he can continue in restricted mode.
So, in this case, in any case, the switching operations end immediately. The crew is supposed to go back or remove restricted mode, so PTC is enabled again before they leave. If they don't, then this fix would at some point trigger a warning or an acknowledgement that the employee, the locomotive engineer, would have to manually state, yes, I want to stay in restricted mode, or no, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so here is what I want to ask about. When they figure out this fix for restricted mode, it has to be the same, configured the same for all railroads, correct?
All railroads that use ITMS.
ITMS will be the same.
Yes, ma'am.
And there are railroads operating IETMS that have passenger traffic on it, correct?
Correct, yes.
Correct, because the Amtrak system is really only on the Northeast Corridor. Outside of that, they are interacting with IETMS trains.
Yes.
Right? So here's my question. When does the warning to the locomotive engineer kick in if the locomotive engineer does not remove restricted mode? When does the warning to say, do you still want to be in restricted mode or don't you? When does that warning under this fix pop up?
That's what's being discussed right now. The CSX offered up after the locomotive moved 3,000 feet. Another railroad offered up that was too short and it would hinder the attention between the engineer and conductor. And they wanted 5 miles before the engineer received the alert or received the prompt.
So CSX wanted somewhere, they told me 1,000 feet in 10 seconds, which would be about 0.2 miles. I've heard 3,000 feet, which is about half a mile. But BNSF came in and said, nope, we think it should be 5 miles. How far from where the switching operations took place in this accident was the signal where the accident occurred? How far?
The westbound train traveled approximately 2 miles to the collision point.
So the train traveled 2 miles. BNSF wants a 5-mile fix, and that's what they're looking at apparently now and leaning towards. It wouldn't have prevented this accident.
Not in this case, no.
And that's my point. Here's a bigger question, and I don't know if you can answer this or Mr. Hall, and normally I don't just pop up with a random question, but I'm going to. Could the railroads have designed their PTC system as not an overlay system, but something more robust? Could they have designed it where they weren't repeatedly putting in human error in the process, which is what PTC was designed to address?
Yes, and there were several. Unfortunately, I've been with the RSAC. I participated in the RSAC when I first started with the NTSB back in '97, and they were discussions of different systems, that not being overlay, being actually the method of operation that moved trains and created a bubble both in front and back, like a moving block system. When the 2008 Railroad Safety Improvement Act came in that mandated PTC, the railroads and FRA I don't want to say to make it easy, but they looked at overlay systems as the fastest method to implement PTC. So that's why they used an overlay method, which is not what they did not have everything that the NTSB had recommended for a PTC system, but that was their solution to meet the mandate.
Yeah, they went with the fastest and the cheapest. And so let me end with one other question, and this is actually on cameras, and I just want to clarify something on cameras. On inward-facing image recorders, and I am glad CSX is putting in cameras, in the FRA and PRM, they stated that they weren't going to mandate it on the freight railroads because the costs, in their view, outweighed the benefits. And what I want to make sure is that after we get done with this meeting and issue our recommendations, that FRA doesn't come back and say, like they did with the speed limits after DuPont, we don't have the authority to do that because the FAST Act only required us to implement it on passenger routes. FRA has very broad authority to implement railroad safety regulations. Does anyone want to clarify that? If not, I'm happy to read from the U.S. Code.
I can ask our general counsel to give you the interpretation she drafted.
Sure.
Happy to. You are correct. You are correct, Member Hamady. We believe that the FRA's broad general railroad safety rulemaking authority, which is found in 49 U.S.C. 20103, would vest the FRA with the discretion to require freight railroads to install cameras.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And good work, everyone. I am done with my questions. Thank you.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. Now, I do want to make a comment. You say the railroads went the fastest and the cheapest way of installing PTC, but as I understand it, BNSF has been developing the ETMS system, which is now IETMS, since around 2003, and here it is 17 years later, and it's still being perfected. And as I understand it, PTC will cost the industry somewhere between $10 and $14 billion. So they have put a lot of effort into it, and so I just wanted to make that statement. Do any of my colleagues have any additional questions or comments before we go to the findings? Okay, well, with that in mind, Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the proposed findings.
Yes, sir. As a result of this investigation, staff proposes the following 11 findings. Number 1, the following factors did not cause or contribute to the collision: train crew experience, impairment of the eastbound train crew, work schedule, train mechanical condition, track condition, traffic control signal system, disabled positive train control system on the eastbound train, and actions by the CSX Transportation Dispatch Center. Number 2, there were no actions the eastbound train engineer or eastbound train conductor could have taken to prevent the collision with the oncoming train. Number 3, this collision could have been prevented had the positive train control system on the westbound train been in active mode as the train approached the stop signal at Control Point Springs. Number 4, the westbound train engineer was impaired by his use of alcohol at the time of the collision. Number 5, although post-accident testing showed the presence of marijuana in the westbound train engineer's system, it cannot be determined if his use of marijuana caused any further impairment. Number 6, the westbound train engineer demonstrated performance detriments while operating the train after completing work on the Carey siding track, as illustrated by the fluctuating train speed, the abnormal use of the locomotive headlight switch, and his failure to take action to stop the westbound train at Control Point Springs. Number 7, CSX Transportation's drug and alcohol testing programs failed to deter the westbound train engineer's illegal use of marijuana and consumption of alcohol, which impaired his performance while on duty and operating the train. Number 8, in light of the shortcomings in the CSX Transportation Random Drug and Alcohol Testing Program, documented in Federal Railroad Administration audits of the program, the circumstances of this collision, and U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General's concerns with the Federal Railroad Administration's auditing processes, an audit of CSX Transportation's testing system that is independent of the Federal Railroad Administration is warranted. Number 9, inward and outward facing recorders can improve the quality of collision investigations and provide the opportunity for proactive steps by railroad management to verify that train crew actions are in accordance with safety rules and procedures. Number 10, the administrative controls specified in Title 49 Code of Federal Regulations 236.1005F in territories with positive train control systems that use the restricted mode feature are inadequate for preventing train-to-train collisions. And number 11, adequate training and managerial oversight are essential for ensuring that rules and procedures for safely operating positive train control systems in restricted mode are followed correctly.
Mr. Curtis, thank you very much. And at this point, we'll do a roll call to make sure that we're prepared to deliberate. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
I'm here.
Okay, there you are. I'm going to pin you on. Member Hamady.
I'm here.
Thank you very much. Member Graham.
Member Graham's on.
And Member Chapman.
And present, Mr. Chairman.
Very good, sir. Okay, so I can see you all. And are there any proposed amendments to the findings? I know that Member Hamady had one. I don't know. It looks like that one's been rectified, so you're okay. And I have one. Before I proceed to offer an amendment, do any of my colleagues have any, at this point, any amendments to the proposed findings?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, with that in mind, I'd like to make a motion, and just for reference, this is what was sent out yesterday around noonish, so there's been no change to that. So my motion is for finding number 9, we will strike the word collision and replace with accident and incident. So finding number 9 would read as follows. Inward and outward facing recorders can improve the quality of accident and incident investigations and provide the opportunity for proactive steps by railroad management to verify that train crew actions are in accordance with safety rules and procedures. That's my motion. Is there a second?
So moved.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. For discussion, I know that it was Member Chapman who suggested, appropriately so in my opinion, that we be consistent with the verbiage throughout the report and that we call this a collision, and I agree with that. However, I will note that just simply doing a global search and replace might have taken one or two things and perhaps limited it to more so than necessary. We have certainly investigated overspeed derailments, for example, that were not collisions. Yes, it could be argued that they collided with the ground, but they're not collisions in the sense of train-to-train collisions. So what I felt is that we should not just limit our verbiage here to recorders to prevent, improve the quality of collision investigations, but for all make it more global accident and incident investigations. So those would be my comments. Any questions or comments from my colleagues before I turn to staff?
I agree, Mr. Chairman. It's a good amendment.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for your suggestion that we do change the language through most of the report to say accidents, to say collision instead of accident. I saw some heads shaking there, so I guess no more comments at this point from my colleagues. So, staff, what would be your viewpoint on this proposed amendment?
Staff concurs with the proposed amendment.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion on this? Okay, thank you. It's been moved and seconded to amend finding number 9 as read, as I presented it. It's been moved and seconded. There's no further discussion. We'll do a roll call vote. Board members will proceed to vote if you favor the motion, please vote aye. If you oppose the motion, please vote nay. So, Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye, and the chairman votes aye. The ayes have it. The findings have, that finding number 9 has been approved as amended. Are there any other amendments proposed to the findings? Okay, do I have a motion to adopt the findings as we just revised for all 11 findings?
So moved.
Second.
I think that was, I believe, the vice chairman that moved, and member Hamady seconded it. Any discussion? Seeing none, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the findings as amended. We'll proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The findings have been adopted unanimously as amended. Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the proposed probable cause.
Staff proposes the following probable cause. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the train collision near Carey, Ohio, was the failure of the westbound train engineer to respond to the signal indications requiring him to slow and stop the train prior to Control Point Springs because of his impairment. Contributing to the collision was the design of the positive train control system, which allowed continued operation in restricted mode on the main track.
Thank you very much. I know that I have a proposed amendment. Are there any other proposed amendments to the probable cause? Okay, seeing none. What I'd like to offer is to amend the probable cause statement. Again, this is just as emailed out yesterday around noonish. I propose that we will add, and I'll read the whole thing in just a moment, that we add, where we talk about impairment, we add due to the effects of alcohol. So my motion is to adopt the probable cause, that we amend the probable cause to read in entirety. So to be very clear, if we vote for this, we're voting on the new probable cause in entirety as amended. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the train collision near Carey, Ohio, was the failure of the westbound train engineer to respond to the signal indications requiring him to slow and stop the train prior to Control Point Springs because of his impairment due to the effects of alcohol. Contributing to the collision was the design of the positive train control system, which allowed continued operation in restricted mode on the main track. So that's my motion to amend the probable cause as I just read it. Is there a second?
Second.
Member Graham has seconded. As far as discussion is concerned, I do believe that I think originally staff intended to have that in there in the original probable cause. They did say something about due to the impairment of the effects of alcohol of the engineer. As it currently reads, it just says his impairment. We can be impaired by a lot of reasons. We can have a stroke. We can be grossly fatigued. In this case, I think it's critical to highlight that it was impairment due to the effects of alcohol. Questions or comments from my colleagues, please? Okay, staff, what would be your thoughts?
Staff concurs with the proposed change.
Okay, thank you very much. Any further discussion? It's been moved and seconded that we amend the probable cause as read, as presented by the chairman. All in favor of adopting the probable cause as read by the chairman, please we'll proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The probable cause has been adopted as amended. With that in mind, Mr. Curtis, if you'll please read the proposed recommendations.
As a result of this investigation, staff proposes the following 5 new safety recommendations. 3 to the U.S. Department of Transportation. 1, direct an independent audit of CSX Transportation's drug and alcohol testing program to determine the circumstances that allowed a regulated employee to operate for an extended time period without being subjected to random drug testing. 2, upon completion of this examination, make any needed recommendations to CSX Transportation in its implementation of its drug and alcohol testing program, as well as the Federal Rail Administration in its auditing of CSX Transportation. 3, if necessary, apply any lessons learned to broadly implement enhancements to railroad drug and alcohol testing protocols to prevent a similar scenario from occurring at other railroads. 1 to the Federal Railroad Administration. Review the software changes being developed by the Interoperable Train Control Application Committee regarding positive train control restricted mode and amend Title 49 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 236, to require railroads to revise their positive train control systems to implement engineering controls that will automatically limit the use of restricted mode on main tracks. And 1 to the Association of American Railroads, the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, National Railroad Passenger Corporation, Alaska Railroad, and the American Public Transportation Association. Inform your members of the circumstances of this collision and request they undertake a review of their training and managerial oversight programs as they relate to restricted speed operations on territories that operate positive train control systems in restricted mode to identify opportunities for training improvement and to implement appropriate mitigating actions. Staff proposes classifying 2 previously issued recommendations in this report. First, to the Federal Railroad Administration, recommendation R-10-1, require the installation in all controlling locomotive cabs and cab car operating compartments of crash and fire protected inward and outward facing audio and image recorders capable of providing recordings to verify that train crew actions are in accordance with rules and procedures that are essential to safety as well as train conditions. The devices should have a minimum 12-hour continuous recording capability with recordings that are easily accessible for review with appropriate limitations on public release for the investigation of accidents or for use by management in carrying out efficiency testing and system-wide performance monitoring programs. This recommendation was previously classified open acceptable response on September 16, 2009. This recommendation is now classified open unacceptable response. And second, recommendation R-10-2, require that railroads regularly review and use in-cab audio and image recordings with appropriate limitations on public release in conjunction with other performance data to verify that train crew actions are in accordance with rules and procedures that are essential to safety. This recommendation was previously classified open acceptable response on September 16, 2009. This recommendation is now classified open unacceptable response. Chairman, that concludes the recommendations.
Thank you very much. And just for clarification, on recommendation 2, it sounded like you may have said the Federal Rail Administration, but I think the way, and I'm not sure if I heard it right, but of course the way it's written is the Federal Railroad Administration. So I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not sure how you read it, but in case I might have misheard it. But okay. In any event, I believe we have a few proposed amendments to the, at least one, to the recommendations. And that would be Member Hamady.
Yes, I have a proposal for a new recommendation to add a recommendation to CSX Transportation. And the recommendation is to review and revise your training program to ensure employees are properly qualified on PTC, including restricted mode.
Okay, that's your motion. Is there a second?
Second for the purposes of discussion, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. So it's been moved and seconded. Member Hamady, you're recognized to defend your motion.
Thank you. In our report, we talk about on page 43 that the NTSB concludes, and this is actually one of the findings we just adopted, that administrative controls specified in the Code of Federal Regulations in territories with PTC systems that use the restricted mode feature are inadequate for preventing train-to-train collisions. Those administrative controls are bulletins, advisories, flip cards that I know that the locomotive engineers have. And we state in a subsequent finding that that additional training and managerial oversight is recommended, are essential for ensuring that rules and procedures for safely operating PTC systems in restricted mode are followed correctly. Now, we've learned that 3 out of the 4 engineers stated, including the eastbound train, stated that they did not feel like they were properly trained. We know there is a 4-hour PTC course. However, we know from a conversation with CSX prior to this meeting that the simulators do not have restricted mode on them. That's something they hope to revise. So already there are revisions they are considering to their training program. And so with that, you know, I think, and I would just add one more thing. You know, across the board, we investigate accidents where we see training failures. In aviation, we've seen major catastrophic accidents within the last 2 years where flight crews were not properly trained, where it was determined that that the carriers thought, or in that case, Boeing thought, pilots would act a certain way when new technology came into their plane. We've seen it in the operation of smaller planes. We've seen it in the operations of personal vehicles where people are driving with new technologies like level 2 automated systems who haven't read a manual and don't understand what they're dealing with and think it's a self-driving car. Time and again, we've seen training deficiencies. PTC is a relatively new technology. While it's been in development for a long time, and the railroads have invested a lot in the system, I think that it could have been more robust, but they have invested a lot. And, you know, we have to make absolutely sure that employees are properly trained on the new technology, whether it's restricted mode or it's PTC. So that's why I'm offering that CSX go back and review their training protocols and revise them.
Member Hamady, thank you very much. Further discussion from my colleagues? Well, you certainly, in my opinion, make a convincing case. So staff, I'd sure love to hear, we would love to hear your viewpoints on this proposed amendment.
Staff has no objection to the proposed amendment. However, I do want to point out that adding this as a new recommendation, we will need a new finding and some additional text in the report to support it. The other thing that I would suggest is in the wording where it says review and revise your training program. We know that CSX is already doing some work, and if the review turns up that they don't need any additional revisions, I think it should be review and revise as necessary, the language of the recommendation.
Thank you for that comment. And Member Hamady, would you consider that as a friendly amendment? It's totally up to you.
Well, can I ask you, Mr. Hall, I consider it as necessary. They know that they've already stated that they're going to make revisions, certainly if we just look at the simulators. I think as necessary is actually a way out. So if they think it's not necessary, they're not going to make improvements. So I actually, I would not advise adding as necessary.
I can certainly support that.
Okay, well, good, thank you. And so if the motion passes, and we can discuss this later, but we would need to, as Mr. Hall pointed out, we would need to go back and add a finding and propose text in the report, which they would then circulate to the board for circulate for our approval. So, but back to the original motion. Member Hamady has offered a motion. It's been seconded by the Vice Chairman. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we will proceed to a roll call vote to approve or disapprove this motion, beginning with Vice Chairman Landsberg.
I'll vote aye.
Aye votes the Vice Chairman Landsberg. Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. And Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. The Member Hamady's motion has passed unanimously. Are there any further amendments to the recommendations? I'll entertain a motion to adopt the recommendations as revised. We just revised one, so the motion, entertaining a motion to adopt the recommendations as revised.
Mr. Chairman, before we proceed, I do just for discussion, I want to raise an issue. I asked a question about the first recommendation calling for an independent audit, and I do have a concern that we should be more specific here. If what we're talking about is asking the DOT Inspector General to conduct an audit, I don't have a written amendment to offer, but I do have some thinking about how we might make a relatively modest modification to this wording to make it explicit that what we're talking about is an Inspector General review. But before I offer any sort of language, I'd just be interested in whether any of the other members share the concern that I have about the lack of specificity.
Member Hamady, go ahead.
Question.
Member Hamady, I'm sorry, I just saw her before you, Vice Chairman. But Member Hamady, you're recognized.
I'll let the Vice Chairman go, and then I can come in.
Great, thanks, Vice Chairman.
Just very simply, who else would you anticipate might be doing such an audit other than the IG?
Well, and that's my point. I think it would be the IG. Maybe that doesn't need to be said, but if what we intend is for the Inspector General to do this, why not say what we mean?
Okay, just asking the question.
Thank you, Member Hamady.
Thank you. I think in my previous life, when I worked on the Hill, if you did not specify who should do it, it didn't happen. And what I would hate is for us to issue a great recommendation. This is a great 3-part recommendation. And for DOT to come back and say, well, FRA already did an audit. They did 2 audits, so we don't need another audit. And so I do think it's warranted.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Member Chapman. What are you proposing?
The language I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, is to start the recommendation with the following wording: request that the Department of Transportation Inspector General direct an independent audit.
Okay. Would you like to, let's see, I'm going to write that down and then, well, let's see. I think General Counsel, did you want to weigh in on that just for a moment?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Is there a formal motion on the table, Member Chapman?
You know, at this, and we're going to get one. So let's go ahead and if you'll please state that. Thank you, Ms. Blaine, and Member Chapman, if you'll please state that in terms of a motion.
Yes, I'll move that we insert the following language: request that the Department of Transportation Inspector General before the recommendation as currently written.
Okay, so that's your motion. And is there a second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved by Member Chapman. It's been seconded by Member Graham, and now we're open for discussion. So let's discuss it. And to be clear, it would say the motion. I'm just restating what I think I heard you say. Request that the DOT. This is a recommendation to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and the recommendation would state: request that the DOT IG direct an independent audit of CSX Transportation, and then continues on drug and alcohol testing program. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So there's the motion. Is there any discussion?
I have an amendment to the amendment.
Okay, let's hear the proposed amendment to the amendment.
So I support Member Chapman's amendment. I would just clarify that it should read: request that the Department of Transportation Inspector General conduct an audit of the CSX Transportation's drug and alcohol testing program to determine the circumstances that allowed a regulated employee to operate for an extended time period without being subjected to random drug testing. So it just removes the words direct and independent and inserts conduct an. So it would start with request that the Department of Transportation Inspector General conduct an.
Okay, Member Chapman, it was you who made the motion, and you've heard basically the plea for a friendly amendment there. What say you?
I'm happy to accept that as a friendly amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and Member Graham, you seconded, so what would be your viewpoint on that?
I would support that. I would be interested in hearing what General Counsel has to say.
Thank you. General Counsel, please.
We would be fine with that language.
Okay, thank you. And before we vote on it, I'll certainly I'll get us to restate it so we know exactly what the verbiage is. Any further discussion within my colleagues before I turn to staff? Okay, seeing none, I'd love to hear And we've already heard from the General Counsel's office. Mr. Hall.
Staff can support that amendment as modified by Member Hamady.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussions? Okay, so just so that we're literally all on the same page, shall I read what the motion is?
Please.
Okay, thanks, and I hope I read this properly. So there's a motion that's been moved and seconded to request that the U.S. Department of Transportation Inspector General, did I get that right so far, Member Hamady? I just want to make sure. Is that what you were proposing?
That's Member Chapman's part.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, all right, thanks. Request that the U.S. Department of Transportation Inspector General conduct an independent audit of CSX Transportation's drug and alcohol testing program to determine the circumstances that allowed a regulated employee to operate for an extended time period without being subjected to random drug testing. Did I state Member Chapman's motion properly?
You would remove the word independent at the beginning.
And Member Hamady, I assume your thinking there, and I agree, is that by definition, a DOTIG audit is an independent audit.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And okay, request that the U.S. Department of Transportation Inspector General conduct an audit of CSX Transportation's drug and alcohol testing program.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for those amendments. That's the motion. It's been seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, we'll proceed to a roll call vote. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Vice Chairman Landsberg votes aye. Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye. That recommendation number 1 has been amended unanimously. Now do I have a motion to adopt all of the recommendations as revised?
So moved.
Second.
Vice Chairman's moved. Member Chapman has seconded. Any discussions? No discussion. All in favor of adopting the recommendations as amended, please vote aye or nay. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Vice Chairman Landsberg votes aye. Member Hamady.
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. Chairman votes aye. The recommendations have been adopted as revised unanimously. Okay, so we're at the point of adopting the final report, and I believe that we have some proposed amendments to the final report. And I know that Member Hamady has some proposed amendments. Do any of my colleagues have proposed amendments in addition to her for the final report? Hey, Member Hamady, you are recognized.
Thank you very much. First, I want to start on 18A. On page 18A, I think that there are additional changes, that clarifications that staff needs to make on the number of random alcohol tests. And I think it would be helpful to have a chart here, somewhere here, which lays out all the tests for drug and alcohol for the conductor and for the engineer for the westbound train. And I don't know if that has to occur in motion format or how you want to address that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have strong feelings of it, but let's put it up for a vote, and basically, well, I'll tell you what, I think we can vote on it on concept now, and then of course, staff will circulate to the board the page changes for our approval. I don't even know if we need to, well, let's vote on it. That way everybody's got to say so on that. Any comments on that? So bottom line is, if you would just put that in the form of a motion and we can get a second.
Yeah, I offer a motion that staff clarify the dates for the random drug and alcohol tests for both the conductor and the engineer, and to insert a chart that will help readers better understand what different testing was done and random testing was done. It doesn't have to apply to the other type of testing like pre-employment, but I think it would help make this section a little bit more clear.
I'll second, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And of course, again, we'll get a chance to actually vote on the actual verbiage once it's circulated, the page changes are circulated. Before it's been moved, I think I just heard a second. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I seconded, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. And General Counsel, Ms. Blaine, I see that you had kind of flicked your camera maybe there for a second. Do you have anything you'd like to weigh in on?
Nope, I was just verifying that there was a second. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. And it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion amongst my colleagues? I would certainly support that. I did think it was a little confusing to this aging brain of mine, and so I think it would help to clarify that. And staff, I'd like to hear your comments, please, before we proceed.
Staff agrees that the addition of two tables, one for the engineer, one for the conductor, that outlines each of their drug tests and alcohol tests and when they occurred, would definitely help the readability of the report. Staff can prepare that and submit it with the language that we will be developing to support the new recommendation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And so it's been moved and it's been seconded. Any further discussion on Member Homidy's motion? Okay, seeing none, I will proceed to a roll call vote for that. Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Homedy.
Aye.
Member Homedy votes aye. Member Graham.
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman.
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. That motion regarding page 18A has been adopted. Member Homedy, I think you have an additional amendment proposed.
Yes, I have two more amendments. I have an amendment to page 4, lines 3 through 17, just to clarify further the information on PTC implementation. It clarifies that the board has issued recommendations stemming back now a little bit more than 50 years for implementation of PTC. And then FRA not too long ago released some new data that the railroads provided for implementation of PTC. And so that's the most recent data. I also clarify regarding Amtrak lines, I think it's important if we're going to put a percentage of implementation for intercity passenger rail lines in Amtrak, that we clarify that's for 100% for Amtrak-owned property. It is not the percentage where they operate, and and for Amtrak-owned property, that's 898 miles. They actually have a network of 21,400 route miles. And so it's important for readers to understand that they're not at 100% implementation right there. In fact, they have, according to FRA's statistics I'm looking at right now, interoperability is at 18.8%. So it's important that that occur. And so I wanted, in total, for all the railroads, Class 1 railroads, short line railroads, commuter railroads, Amtrak railroads, they are at about 65.5% for interoperability. And, the deadline's on December 31st. So I just wanted to clarify all that with the most recent data in the report. I think you're on mute.
Yes, I know that many of you have been wanting to do that for a long time, to mute me, but and it worked. Thank you. And I've got in paper here, I think we all have in paper, what would be the specific verbiage of your motion?
Okay, I guess I should have started with that. So let me read my very long piece of paper. Or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, or as a possibility, perhaps you could just point out for over strike 45 and 50 or okay.
All right, so we have for over 45 years, I insert 50. Right now we have the congressionally mandated deadline for PTC implementation was December 31st, 2018. I replaced that with the congressionally mandated deadline was December 31st, 2015. However, it was later extended to December 31st, 2018, and again to December 31st, 2020. In the next sentence would read, according to data reported to the FRA as of June 30, 2020, PTC is operational, in paren, including in revenue service demonstration, on 100% of Amtrak-owned or controlled track, 76.1% of commuter lines, and 100% of Class 1 and short line railroads. However, we would strike the next line on locomotives, and we would add a line. However, only 65.5% of tenants were able to communicate with the PTC systems of the host railroad in paren interoperable. I also would add a footnote which states Amtrak owns or controls 898 route miles. Amtrak operates a nationwide rail network serving more than 500 destinations in 46 states, the District of Columbia, and 3 Canadian provinces on more than 21,400 miles of routes, which are primarily owned and operated by freight railroads. Freight railroads are responsible for installing PTC on their track. The systems must be interoperable to meet the deadline.
Okay, thank you. Before I call for a second on that, there's your motion. And General Counsel, Ms. Blaine, would you be comfortable with that, the way that she's read that, since we have the strikeouts and the additions, and she was simply pointing out to us those changes, or would you feel that and it was me who suggested that, by the way, so if it's, you can blame me if that's wrong, but I want to make sure that from a procedural point of view, would be in line by just doing it that way.
We are in order as it was done.
Okay, thank you very much. And so Member Hamady has made a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by the Vice Chairman. I want to make sure, by the way, that each of you and all of us who will be voting on this are comfortable with the way that she read it. Again, I suggested it just so she wouldn't have to read the whole thing, but everybody understand what we're about to discuss and vote on? Okay, good, thank you. All right, so you've heard Member Hamady's motion. It's been seconded. Is there any discussion amongst my colleagues? Seeing none, Mr. Hall, what would be staff's viewpoint?
Staff concurs with the proposed change.
Thanks. Okay. It's been moved and seconded to adopt Member Hamady's report page amendments as read. It's been moved and seconded. What say you on a vote, Vice Chairman Landsberg?
I vote aye.
Vice Chairman Landsberg votes aye. Member Hamady?
Aye.
Member Hamady votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. And Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The chairman votes aye. So Member Hamady's amendment to the report has been adopted. Now, before we call for a vote to approve yes, go ahead.
I have one more amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you do? Okay, okay. I didn't see that. Go right ahead, please.
I have a very short sentence amendment for page 23A.
All right, 23A. There it is right there. I got it. Yeah, I've been writing on that page. Okay, please. You're recognized.
I offer a motion to amend page 23A after the sentence that ends on line 12, which would be the second, after the second sentence in that paragraph, you would add the following: CSX simulators do not include training on PTC restricted mode.
Okay, can I ask a question about that? Well, I tell you what, I do have a question, but I should allow it to go to a second. So is there a second for Member Homendy's motion?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Member Homendy, would you mind if I asked a question?
Sure.
I just want to make sure. See, because on the page change that came out last night at 2 o'clock, or dated 2 o'clock, that paragraph had already been struck.
No, I think that was earlier.
Yeah, so
and I took that out of my amendment. So that may have been circulated. I'm sorry. That was circulated in the original amendment, but I'm now changing that. Since it was changed, I'm not addressing that earlier section. There were two sections where simulators were mentioned in the previous draft. One was in an area that I think just got added in editing. And then the actual section on simulators on 23A. And so yes, I would not be changing the earlier area, which has now been removed. I'm just amending page 23A after the second sentence that ends on line 12. And this is section, to clarify, 1.8.2 PTC training.
Yes. And we're going to add it before the third sentence, which says all PTC simulation testing is scored?
Correct.
Okay. So what I was trying to make the point of is that, as you all know, at 7:09 last night, some page changes came out which struck some paragraphs that were erroneously on page 18 regarding PTC. At yesterday morning, when we woke up, they had added that section correctly to page 23A, but they had not struck it from page 18. So, yes, so I now understand exactly what you're doing, but I want to make sure that everybody else in the room does as well. So really, forget 18, since technically that page no longer, that part no longer exists. And let's go to page 23A and add what you're proposing as the third sentence, which happens to end on line 12, I believe.
Correct.
Okay, I see a lot of people looking around on that. I want to make sure I think it has been moved and it has been seconded, so we're in order there, but I want to make sure that everyone understands what the placement of this is.
What's the previous sentence that ends just prior to the insertion, Mr. Chairman?
Member Homendy, would I be correct to say that the previous sentence, well, shall I just read the, okay, so I think it would read this way. Remember, Homendy, I'm sorry, it's your motion, so go ahead and just read how page 23A, beginning on line 9, up through the completion of your sentence, your proposed motion.
It would read, the simulator training is comprised of 60 miles and lasts between 3 and 4 hours. During this training, the engineer performs all of the functions of PTC, including initialization, updating the consist, verifying mandatory directives, successfully maneuvering through work zones by answering prompts, complying with stop signal indications, and other required functions. Then my addition to that would be CSX simulators do not include training on PTC restricted mode. Then it would continue on as exists in the rest of the paragraph.
Even I could follow that, so thank you for going back and reading it. Is there any question at all about what we're doing here before we take a vote? I just want to make sure that everybody's clear on that. Okay, is there any discussion about Member Hamedy's motion from my colleagues? Yes, sir, Member Graham.
I think it's an excellent addition to the report.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you. Thank you very much. Anything else from my colleagues before I go to Mr. Hall? Okay, Mr. Hall, what would be staff's opinion?
Staff agrees with the proposed insertion.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been moved and seconded that we are going to add verbiage to line 23 or page 23A, line 12. And it would be to add CSX simulators do not include training on PTC restricted mode. It's been moved and seconded. Roll call vote, Vice Chairman Landsberg.
Aye.
Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamedy?
Aye.
Member Hamedy votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. Chairman votes aye. Member Hamedy's motion has been adopted unanimously. Okay, any other proposed amendments to the final draft, to the final report? Now, I'm going to call for a motion to adopt the final report as amended, but I want everybody to understand that we're expecting staff to circulate page changes for our approval for an amendment that the table, the drug and alcohol testing on page 18A that Member Hamedy's motion has called for, that we adopted unanimously, as well as Member Hamedy had a new recommendation that we approved unanimously. And so at Mr. Hall's suggestion, there will be some revised text to support that, that amendment, that new recommendation, as well as a new finding. So everybody understands what's going to happen there. Staff will circulate page changes for those issues. Do I have a motion to adopt the final report as amended?
So moved.
It's been so moved by the Vice Chairman. Is there a second?
Second, Mr. Chairman.
Member Chapman has seconded. Any discussion? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Vice Chairman Landsberg?
Aye.
Aye. Vice Chairman votes aye. Member Hamedy?
Aye.
Member Hamedy votes aye. Member Graham?
Aye.
Member Graham votes aye. Member Chapman?
Aye.
Member Chapman votes aye. The Chairman votes aye. The final report has been adopted as revised, and it was adopted unanimously. Any additional comments or things that anyone would like to say related to this report? Okay, do any of my colleagues wish to file a concurring or dissenting statement? Okay, I see none. So it's now my turn. And those participating in the board meeting, you're welcome to keep your cameras on, or you're welcome to turn them off. It's up to you and your microphones. In closing, I do want to thank my colleagues for your preparation in going into this board meeting. It's obvious that a lot of work has gone into this, and it's apparent that you've studied very hard to understand the issues. So thank you for that, and for the good discussion today. I think we get a better report when we discuss these things. So thank you very much. Special thanks to the Office of Rail, Pipeline, and Hazardous Materials Investigations, and especially also to Research and Engineering for their work on the toxicology and other things, the recorders, all of that. Ruben Payan, I want to thank you as the investigator in charge. I always like to point out that whatever goes on here at the NTSB, it's a group effort, and to put on a webcast like this, a board meeting virtually, it's different, but I think our CIO staff has allowed us to have a platform that we can do it fairly seamlessly. That said, I can't wait for the day that we can get back in our boardroom. So a sincere thanks not only to the people who worked on the report, but to the support and program staff who made it all possible. The recommendations that we've adopted today, if acted upon, will result in the U.S. Department of Transportation making a hard look at its drug and alcohol testing program to determine how a regulated employee could go a decade without being subjected to DOT testing, drug testing. If today's recommendation is acted upon, the DOT would implement changes to its program to address any identified problems. The recommendations issued today would result in the Federal Railroad Administration requiring changes to its positive train control systems that would automatically limit the use of restricted mode on main tracks. Recommendations classified today, if acted upon, would result in the long overdue installation of inward and outward facing image recorders on all controlling locomotive cabs and all cab control cars, operating compartments. And they would result in the review and the use of data captured by these recorders to verify that train crews are acting in accordance with safety rules and procedures. Fortunately, in this event, no one was killed or even seriously injured, but nevertheless, it did ruin a few rail cars and locomotives and almost $5 million in damage. If the recommendations issued today and reclassified today are acted upon, these actions could result in future lives being saved. Thank you. We stand adjourned.